Good evening, wherever you are, whatever time your clock insists it is. You've tuned into a quiet corner of the night, a place where the restless, the sleepless, and the curious come to listen. Out there, the world is fast asleep, but here the hours stretch longer, shadows lean closer, and stories take their time to unfold. Tonight, I'll be your companion, your voice in the dark. It was his wife, as she had sat 100 evenings by the fireplace, thumbing her favorite worn copy of Leaves of Grass, humming softly as though music were hidden between the lines. George pressed his hands to the cold metal railing, afraid to blink. Perhaps it was only a trick of the light. Perhaps grief, like fog, could shape stone into memory. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. This was not a goddess, nor a philosopher. Our first story begins with statues that never speak, unless they've been waiting for you all along. The 7 silent statues. George Whitmore learned this truth the first week he moved into the Ashford Towers, a gleaming complex of glass and steel perched above the city's edge. On the brochures, they called it luxury living among history. What they really meant was that the developer had carved out a private garden in the middle of the towers, a courtyard where 7 statues of Greek philosophers stood in a perfect circle, their eyes cast down, as though each of them had grown weary of human words. The residents called them the 7 silent statues. 7, and no more. George arrived at Ashford with 2 suitcases, a set of worn books, and the brittle bones of a man who had grown accustomed to moving quietly through the world. He was in his late 60s, his hair already white at the edges, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. 2 years had passed since Eleanor's death, and still the silence of his apartment felt like a punishment. He did not choose Ashford for the prestige, or the amenities, or the view of the city skyline. He chose it because of the courtyard. He had seen it only once, in a photograph on the leasing agent's desk. The statues arranged in a ring, the fountain in the center, the pathways curling like veins between hedges. Something in the image tugged at him, the stillness, the symmetry, the echo of something older than his grief. On his first night in the new apartment, George poured himself a glass of water, pulled a chair to the balcony, and looked down. No, this was a figure seated on a low stool, her head bowed as though reading from an open book balanced on her lap. And in that first glance, George's chest constricted, because he knew that posture. He knew the gentle curve of the shoulders, the way the hair was gathered at the nape, the line of the jaw tilted downward toward words unspoken. It was Eleanor.
The sound Alex made when the steel slid into him, shocked, betrayed, final. Mark had told himself it was the sickness talking, the paranoia, the anger that clouded reason. But hearing it now, played back to him in a stranger's warped voice, felt like judgment.
The courtyard glowed under the lamps, 7 figures of stone, their white marble luminous in the dark. They stood as if frozen mid-thought, one philosopher with his chin resting on his hand, another raising a finger to the sky, one with a scroll tucked beneath his arm, each face sculpted into an expression of patient endurance. But George's eyes stopped at the figure in the center, a woman, not a goddess, not Athena with her helmet, not a muse with her lyre. The next morning, George inquired about the statues with the building manager, a trim man named Mr. Caro who wore his suit like a uniform. There are 7, Caro said briskly, flipping through a maintenance ledger. All reproductions of the Hellenic originals, commissioned replicas, quite valuable. We take great pride in them. Residents find them dignified. George nodded slowly. And the one in the center? The seated figure? Caro looked up. Seated? No, sir. You must have miscounted. There are only 7, and all are standing. You'll see the central point of the courtyard is the fountain, not a statue. George opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Perhaps he had been mistaken. Perhaps the angle from his balcony had deceived him. But that night, when the lights dimmed in the courtyard, he looked again, and there she was, the seated poet, head bent, book resting in her lap. Eleanor. The nights began to shape themselves around the statue. George found excuses to wander the garden after dusk, walking slowly along the gravel paths, cane tapping against the stone. The statues loomed above him, their features blurred by shadow, but when he reached the center, he always stopped. The poet never looked up. Her stone eyes were lowered, lips parted in a silence he recognized. At first, he told himself it was a harmless comfort. What could be wrong with speaking aloud in a garden where no one else lingered at such hours? So he began to talk to her. "I brought your books with me," he murmured one evening, voice trembling. "I thought it might feel less lonely if they were here." On another night, "Do you remember the sea? That trip to Crete? The white cliffs? You said the wind there sounded like the hymn of gods." The stone did not answer, but George swore that the angle of her head shifted only by a fraction, but enough to suggest she was listening. And once, only once, he saw a faint line trace her cheek, like water, sliding down from the hollow of the eye to the corner of the mouth, like a tear. George's nights grew longer. He no longer bothered with television or the polite small talk of neighbors in the elevators. He waited until the courtyard emptied, until the lights of other apartments flickered out one by one, and then he slipped down to the garden. His shoes knew the path. His lips carried words he had not spoken in years. But with each visit, a doubt crept closer, whispering, if this was Eleanor, why had no one else seen her? Why did Caro insist there were only 7 statues, all male, all accounted for? One evening, as George brushed his fingers against the marble's cold surface, he whispered, "They don't believe you exist. They don't believe you're here." The stone was unyielding beneath his palm. Yet when he stepped back, his breath caught, for the figure was no longer seated with a book. Her arms had shifted. One hand now rested across her lap, the other extended outward, palm open, as though reaching for him. George staggered back, clutching his chest. No, that's not possible. He turned in a circle, scanning the garden. The other statues remained motionless, their faces lost to shadow. But here was Eleanor, caught in a new gesture, hand outstretched. The night wind carried the faintest sound, not a voice, not quite, more like the scrape of stone against stone. George swallowed hard, a shiver running through his spine. He whispered, "What are you asking me to do?" The silence of the courtyard answered, thick and heavy. Yet in that silence, George thought he heard the beginning of an echo. Not words, not yet, only the suggestion of breath. He did not flee. He did not call for help. He only lowered himself onto the edge of the fountain, staring at the stone figure as though waiting for her to move again. And in the stillness of that midnight hour, George knew, whatever the truth of the statues, he was no longer alone. Grief doesn't simply live inside a man. It seeps outward, staining the corners of every place he inhabits, reshaping walls, gardens, even silence itself. What begins as memory becomes landscape, until one can no longer tell whether the world has changed, or only the eyes that look upon it. For George Whitmore, the Ashford courtyard had become that landscape. What others saw as Ornament 7 ancient replicas frozen in scholarly poses, George now regarded as a threshold, a door half open, where one figure waited to be acknowledged. By the second month of his residency, George's nights no longer resembled sleep. They resembled pilgrimage. At the stroke of 11, he would leave his apartment and step into the courtyard, cane striking rhythm against the stone path. The lamps cast their usual dim halos. The fountain murmured its patient music. And there she Saturday, the poet, Eleanor. George could not bear to doubt anymore. Whatever words the manager offered about only 7 statues fell away the instant he laid eyes on her bowed head. The marble book balanced on her lap. But something had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. The weight of her silence carried a new gravity. It was not the stillness of stone, it was the expectancy of someone holding back, waiting. One night, George carried down a scarf. It had been Eleanor's, folded carefully in the drawer since the winter before her death. Wool the color of rusted leaves, faint with cedar. He hesitated at her feet, afraid the gesture might feel foolish. But grief gives no room for pride. He draped it across her lap. The scarf slid from the marble, falling soundlessly to the ground. George stooped to retrieve it, muttering to himself, and when he lifted his eyes again, he froze. The fingers of her left hand were not flat as before. They were curled ever so slightly inward, as though they had made an effort to catch what had been offered. From that night forward, George lived in 2 realities. The daylight world meals alone, the polite nods of neighbors in the elevator, the weight of his son Daniel's absence, and the midnight world where stone softened, memory returned, and Eleanor seemed to breathe again through marble lips. He could not remain silent forever. On the 3rd week, desperate for proof, He invited Daniel to dinner. His son arrived as always. Pressed shirt, distracted frown, phone buzzing in his pocket. They ate, they drank, they exchanged brittle words about health and weather. But when dessert was gone and the night pressed close, George cleared his throat. "Daniel, there's something you need to see." In the courtyard, he led his son straight to the fountain. His voice trembled. "There, the poet. Do you see her?" Daniel blinked, scanning the garden. "Dad, what am I supposed to be looking at?" "The eighth statue. The woman seated with the book. It's your mother." Daniel counted under his breath, pointing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's all. They're all men. Look, the fountain's empty in the middle." "No." George clutched his son's sleeve. "Look again. She's right there. Eleanor." But when George turned back, the stool was gone. The figure had vanished. Only the fountain glimmered in the lamplight, mocking his certainty. Daniel left early, murmuring about doctors and medication. George remained on the balcony long after, blanket over his shoulders, staring down at the courtyard. His heart thudded painfully. Had he imagined her? Had grief carved hallucination into his sight? For 1 long hour he sat in silence, wrestling against the weight of disbelief. And then, with eyes burning, he glanced down again. There she was, returned, waiting at the fountain as if she had never left. The following weeks dissolved into obsession. George ate less, slept less. He returned night after night, whispering to her, words of confession, words of longing. The courtyard became a cathedral of one. His voice cracked against the stillness, but each time he left, he felt her listening, until the night of rain. The storm arrived without warning, sheets of water hammering the tiles. Against every sensible thought, George descended with his umbrella, driven by fear she might vanish if he did not appear. Through the curtain of rain, she shimmered. Water coursed over her marble body, and George stepped close, hand trembling. As he brushed a rivulet from her cheek, he felt the truth under his fingers. Not smoothness, but a shallow groove carved from eye to mouth. A channel, a tear. "You're weeping," he whispered. Lightning cracked overhead. Thunder rolled through the courtyard like a drum, and beneath it, for the first time, George thought he heard something else. A sound faint but certain, stone against stone, a body shifting. The neighbors noticed. They whispered when he passed. In the lobby, their eyes slipped away too quickly. One man confronted him directly. "Caro, the manager." "Mr. Whitmore," Caro began, voice brittle. "We've received comments about your behavior in the garden. Some find it unsettling." George's jaw tightened. "I walk. I talk. That's all." Caro's eyes glinted. "There are 7 statues. Always 7. Please do not claim otherwise." George's breath caught. How had Caro known what he said? Unless the man had been listening, watching, lurking in the shadows of the courtyard. The thought poisoned him. That evening, George pressed his palm to the statue's cold cheek. His voice cracked into pleading. "They don't believe you. They want to erase you." For the first time, the silence seemed to answer, not with words, not yet, but with a pressure in the air, a pulse beneath the fountain's gurgle. George leaned closer, ear brushing stone. His skin prickled. A murmur. Not language, only the cadence of breath. But it was enough to root his faith deeper than reason. From then on, George no longer considered her a statue at all. He dreamed of her nightly, stone lips whispering, body poised to rise. Each morning he woke with dust at the back of his throat, as though he had been breathing the courtyard itself. And with each midnight visit, the changes grew bolder. A hand extended farther, a tilt of the knees. Once he swore her shoulders had shifted, not bowed but bracing, as if preparing to stand. Small movements. H impossible. Ich undeniable. George Whitmore had stopped mourning his wife. He was waiting for her return. And in his marrow, he knew this. When she rose, she would not rise alone. George Whitmore had stopped marking time in days. Time was no longer measured by calendars or the ticking of clocks, but by the cadence of nights, by the rhythm of footsteps carrying him down the same path into the courtyard. The rest of the world felt thin, fragile, and irrelevant. His apartment existed only as a holding place until the hour came when he could descend to her again. Each evening he waited, and each evening she was there, Waiting, too. The neighbors had begun to notice. They did not confront him directly, but silence itself betrayed them. Conversations hushed when George entered the lobby. Eyes shifted away when he passed. A few, emboldened by whispers, regarded him with pity. He heard it in the pauses, in the thinning of air around him. The widower. The man who talks to stone. Perhaps they thought he was unraveling. Perhaps they were right. But what none of them understood was that stone itself was unraveling too, shifting beneath their very noses. It began with the cracks, hairline fractures running along the robes of one philosopher, so faint they could have been veins in the marble. George noticed them first on a Tuesday evening, faint as spider webs glinting in lamplight. He traced one with his fingertip, feeling the jagged edge. At the time, he told himself it was nothing weathering, perhaps, the ordinary fatigue of replicas left outdoors. Yet something about the way the crack curved disturbed him. It was not random. It curled at the edge of the statue's mouth, bending upward, almost like a smile. The following night, he found another, a seam along the base of another figure's neck, angling toward the ear, and another after that, stretching across a philosopher's brow. Soon he began to realize each of the 7 bore some subtle change, a split, a mark, an alteration so slight no one else seemed to notice. But George noticed. He noticed because the 8th had taught him how to look. The poet herself grew bolder. Her head, once bowed in perpetual silence, had lifted just slightly, enough that George could see the hollow suggestion of her eyes beneath stone lids. He swore her lips parted wider now, a breathless pause carved deeper by the nights. Once, he dared to place his palm against her chest, half expecting only cold rock. Yet beneath the marble he felt something faint, rhythmic, the ghost of a pulse that pressed weakly against his hand. It terrified him, and it bound him tighter than ever. By now, George spoke freely to her. He no longer whispered but carried entire conversations in the courtyard, convinced that, though her replies were still inaudible, she was answering in her own way. He spoke of Eleanor's laughter, of evenings by the fire, of the time they traveled to Greece when they were young and climbed the steps of ruined temples together. He confessed the loneliness that gnawed at him like rust. He admitted that he sometimes woke in the night certain she was still in the room, breathing softly beside him. The words spilled out unchecked, filling the courtyard until the silence seemed swollen with them. And then, one night, he realized he was not the only one listening. It was a woman on the 4th floor who heard it first. As George returned from his midnight ritual, she stepped out of the elevator, clutching her mail, and looked at him with wary eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "I heard something last night from my window in the courtyard. It sounded like stone scraping, like something heavy moving." George's heart jolted. At last, proof. He leaned toward her, voice eager. Yes, you heard her too." But the woman's face tightened. She muttered an excuse and hurried away. George realized too late how he must have sounded. The intensity in his eyes, the way his words pressed too close. Still, the seed had been planted. Others had heard. The statues were no longer his secret alone. The garden itself seemed to change with each night. The air grew heavier, damp with a smell like old earth turned in a grave. The lamps cast weaker halos, their glow dimming as though pressed upon by some greater shadow. Even the fountain's steady trickle seemed different, slower, more deliberate, as though its water was not circulating but bleeding. George sometimes lingered past midnight, long enough for the stillness to grow unbearable. In those hours, the courtyard did not feel deserted. It felt crowded, dense, with presence. The silence was too thick, as though layered by more than one listener. He would glance over his shoulder and swear the other statues had shifted ever so slightly, not enough to betray motion, but enough to suggest they were no longer facing quite the same direction as before. Once, standing at the edge of the circle, George froze. He realized the philosophers were angled inward, not in reflection, not in detached contemplation, but toward him, toward her. When he looked again, they were still, but his skin prickled with certainty. The ring was closing. The pressure of it began to poison his waking hours. He found it difficult to focus on anything beyond the garden. The corridors of Ashford grew claustrophobic. His son's calls, when they came, felt distant and unreal. Daniel pressed him about doctors, about therapy, about moving somewhere more fitting for his age. George ended the conversations quickly. His son did not understand. None of them understood. At night, Eleanor did. The poet listened. She listened with her silence, with her shifting form, with the subtle softening of marble into flesh. One evening, George knelt before her, hands trembling. "They think I'm mad," he murmured. "They want me to forget you. But I won't. I can't. You are here, and you are mine." In answer, or what he took for answer, her hand, once folded demurely in her lap, had slipped lower, extended as though to touch the ground. And at the base of her stone palm lay something new, a fragment of parchment, so small he might have missed it if not for the way his eyes had been trained to search. He lifted it with shaking fingers. A curl of paper browned at the edges, soft as if handled too many times. Across it was scrawled a single line, faint but unmistakable. "I am the 8th. You have seen me." The handwriting was hers, Eleanor's hand. George pressed the paper to his lips, tears flooding his eyes. The courtyard seemed to shudder around him, the statues holding their breath. The air swelled with a pressure so immense he thought his lungs might collapse. For a moment, he swore he could hear voices, not one, but several layered whispers threading through the branches overhead. He could not make out words, only the rhythm, low and insistent, like a chant, and then silence again. He clutched the paper to his chest and staggered back to his apartment. His faith had never been stronger. She was not an illusion. She was reaching for him. The stone was breaking, just as his grief had broken him, and the others were awakening too, their cracks widening into mouths, their fractures bending into expressions no craftsman had carved. The following days blurred. George found excuses to stay inside, avoiding the neighbors. He lived on scraps of food, surviving only for nightfall. When at last he returned to the courtyard, he realized the change was no longer subtle. The circle of statues had closed. Not entirely, but enough to feel suffocating. The gap between them narrower, their shadows overlapping, their cracked mouths glinting in faint smiles. And the poet, his Eleanor, no longer seemed seated in stillness. Her body leaned forward, poised, her hands braced as though she were preparing, at last, to rise. George felt both terror and rapture bloom within him. He had asked for proof, and proof was arriving. The garden no longer belonged to stone. It belonged to something stirring inside it. He whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking with devotion and dread. "I'm ready." And as the words left his mouth, the fountain behind him gave a sound it had never made before, not a trickle, not a gurgle, but a long exhale, like the sigh of something waking after a very long sleep. George Whitmore had never been a man of confrontation. His life with Eleanor had been defined by gentleness, by evenings in quiet rooms, by the soft comfort of words instead of raised voices. But grief remakes a man, and obsession hardens him. By the time the autumn leaves browned and fell across the courtyard, George had convinced himself of one thing. He must make them see. His son, the neighbors, even Caro, with his smug smile and ledger of rules. They had to know the truth that there were not 7 statues, but 8, and that the 8th was his wife returned. It was Daniel he turned to first. He called his son late in the afternoon, voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "Come tonight," George said. "Please, I'll show you. You'll understand." Daniel's sigh came across the line, a mixture of exhaustion and reluctant pity. "Dad, I don't think tonight," George cut in, surprising even himself with the firmness in his tone. 11 o'clock, in the courtyard. "If you love your mother, you'll come." There was silence, heavy and long. At last Daniel muttered, "Fine, but this is the last time." George hung up with hands trembling, not from fear but anticipation. At last, the proof would no longer be his burden alone. When night fell, George dressed carefully, as though for an appointment with destiny. He wore the jacket Eleanor had once said made him look dignified, and in his pocket he folded the parchment scrap she had given him, the words written in her hand. "I am the 8th. You have seen me." At 11, he made his way down to the courtyard. The lamps burned weaker than usual, halos pressed thin by the weight of shadow. The air carried a chill sharper than the season warranted, damp and heavy, filled with the smell of stone turned wet. The statues loomed around the fountain, their cracked mouths glinting faintly, and there seated, poised forward, lips parting wider with every night, was Eleanor. George's breath caught. She was nearer to rising than ever before. He could see it in the tension of her arms, in the subtle lean of her torso. The stone seemed softer now, no longer unyielding marble, but something porous, something waking. He whispered her name, Eleanor. A sound stirred in reply, not speech, not yet, but the low grind of weight shifting. Then came the echo of footsteps. Daniel entered from the far archway, coat collar raised, his face set in weary lines. His eyes scanned the circle impatiently, ready to dismiss whatever his father intended. "Dad," Daniel said, voice flat. "I don't know what you think, I'll see." George pointed with trembling hand. "There, look, the 8th. Your mother, she's here." Daniel followed his father's gaze, squinting into the gloom, his brow furrowed. "Dad, there's nothing. Just the fountain. Just the same 7 statues I've seen every time." "No." George's voice cracked into desperation. "She's right there. She's rising. Look harder." But Daniel only shook his head, pity softening into frustration. "This isn't healthy. You need help. I'm calling someone tomorrow." George staggered toward the statue, his cane clattering against the stone path. He reached her side, pressing both palms against her arm. "Touch her. She's warm, Daniel. She's alive." Daniel stepped back, alarm flaring in his eyes. "Dad, please. You're scaring me." And then it happened. From beneath George's palms came a vibration, subtle but unmistakable. The stone trembled, like a muscle tightening beneath flesh. George gasped, his eyes wild. "Do you feel that? Do you hear it?" The courtyard answered with a sound deeper than any voice, the groan of stone shifting. The philosophers surrounding them leaned closer, their cracked mouths widening. For one impossible instant, George swore their eyes glittered with something wet, something alive. Daniel stumbled back, pale. What was that?" The air thickened, pressing down like the weight of an ocean. The fountain gurgled louder, its trickle now a steady surge, water spilling over its rim. The ground beneath their feet quivered, faint but real, and then the poet's head lifted, fully, her eyes opening to reveal hollows dark as wells. Her lips parted, and from them came a sigh that rustled like centuries of dust, escaping. George dropped to his knees, tears streaming. "Eleanor, you've come back." Daniel's voice rose, panicked. "Dad, it's not real, you're hallucinating." But even as he spoke, his words faltered, for the statue's hand had moved, extending outward, fingers uncurling with a slow, grinding sound. From between them slipped another fragment of parchment, fluttering to the ground at George's feet. He snatched it up, heart hammering, and held it aloft for his son to see. On it, scrawled in the same hand, were 4 words, "You will join me." Daniel swore under his breath, face drained of color. "This is sick. Someone planted that. Someone's messing with you." But George's laughter rang out, brittle and joyous. "No, it's her. She's calling us back together." The statues pressed closer. The circle seemed to shrink, their massive forms tilting inward. Cracks split wider across their marble skins, and through the seams George glimpsed something glistening beneath, something neither flesh nor stone. The air vibrated with low murmurs, a chorus of voices too layered to separate. Words formed at the edge of hearing, a chant rising from a throat that was not one throat but many. Daniel stumbled to the exit, terror playing on his face. "I'm leaving. This place isn't right. Dad, come with me." But George could not move. He clutched the parchment, his knees pressed into the cold stone, his eyes locked on Eleanor as she leaned farther forward, bracing as though to rise. He whispered, "I will not leave you. Not again." The ground shuddered beneath him. The fountain burst with sudden force, water spilling across the tiles, lapping against his legs. The statues groaned, leaning closer, their stone jaws splitting into crude smiles. Daniel's shouts echoed distantly, but George no longer heard. All he heard was the low voice spilling from Eleanor's lips at last, shaping itself into words. "Stay," one word, soft, broken, and yet unmistakably hers. George bowed his head, sobbing. Yes. The courtyard convulsed. Water surged higher, swallowing the fountain's rim, flooding across the floor. Shadows swirled thick around the statues, as though the marble itself were bleeding darkness. The circle closed tighter, their massive forms looming like sentinels. Eleanor's body strained against its seat, stone arms shaking with the effort of rising. Daniel's voice broke through the chaos. "Dad, please get out." But George did not move. He spread his arms wide, as if welcoming the tide. His face shone with tears and rapture, for in that moment, he knew. The boundary between grief and miracle had shattered. The statues were no longer stone, the courtyard no longer ground. It was a threshold, and he had chosen his side. The last thing he saw before darkness surged was Eleanor's form lifting, her stone knees leaving the stool, her mouth parting in a smile that belonged both to her and to something older, deeper, and endless. By the time neighbors awoke to the sound of sirens, the courtyard had quieted again. The police came, and the manager, and Daniel pacing frantic in the lobby. They found only 7 statues, unbroken, unchanged, standing in their eternal poses. The fountain trickled as gently as it always had. No sign of flooding, no cracks in the marble, no parchment scraps on the ground. George Whitmore was gone. Morning light never carried the weight of truth in Ashford Towers. The sun rose dutifully, spilling its pale warmth across the glass facades, painting neat golden lines across windows and balconies. Birds resumed their song. The city outside stirred with the measured rhythm of ordinary life. But in the courtyard, where 7 philosophers stood in their eternal circle, nothing seemed disturbed. The fountain trickled softly. The lamps clicked off one by one. The tiles shone faintly, damp only with dew. There was no trace of the flood George had seen, no water line etched against the stone. No fragments of parchment lay curled upon the ground. No marks of struggle, no discarded cane, no sign of the man who had knelt at the foot of the poet, whispering to her as though to a wife reborn. To the neighbors who leaned curiously from their balconies, it was simply another morning. To the staff who passed briskly through the courtyard, polishing brass handles and sweeping fallen leaves, it was an ordinary day. And to Mr. Caro, the manager who prided himself on order, the courtyard's perfection was proof that rumors were just that, inventions of a grieving mind. George Whitmore was gone. Daniel gave his statement twice, once to the police, who noted his agitation with bureaucratic detachment, and again to the building staff, who asked only perfunctory questions. He told them what he could, that he had come at his father's request, that George had seemed obsessed, delirious, that he had spoken to statues as though they listened, that the ground itself had seemed to shake, the fountain to swell, the air to thicken with voices, and then nothing, darkness. When he opened his eyes again, his father was gone. The police noted the words hallucination and confusion in their report. They reminded him that stress, combined with age and declining health, often produced delusions. They suggested perhaps George had wandered off, perhaps he had fallen elsewhere. An investigation was opened, but without evidence it faltered quickly. By the week's end, George was listed as missing. Daniel tried to insist. He pressed the memory of the parchment scraps, the whisper in the courtyard, the impossible sense that the statues themselves had leaned closer. But with each retelling, his own words sounded less credible, more fevered, and the looks in the officer's eyes hardened into the same dismissive pity he had seen before. "Your father was grieving," one of them told him gently. "People see what they need to see. They believe what they must. That doesn't make it real." But Daniel was not sure. Because when he returned to the courtyard alone, compelled to search once more, he found something he could not explain. The philosophers stood as always, 7 figures ringed around the fountain, but the circle felt tighter, subtle, but enough that Daniel sensed the space between them had closed. Their marble skin was smooth again, flawless, without cracks, and yet their faces seemed altered, if only by a fraction. A curl at the corner of one mouth, a furrow deeper in the brow of another. The air carried a weight to it, as though the courtyard itself held its breath. Daniel circled slowly, trying to count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He forced himself to stop there, not to linger too long at the fountain, not to let his eyes fall upon the space where his father had insisted there was another. But curiosity tugged at him. He let his gaze flicker down, just for an instant. There was nothing, only water catching light, only the reflection of the 7. And yet, for a heartbeat, he thought he saw the suggestion of a figure seated at the fountain's edge, a shadow faint as breath, a silhouette bowing over an unseen book. He blinked, and it was gone. Weeks passed. Life at Ashford Towers resumed its rhythms. New residents moved in, unaware of the missing man whose name had already begun to fade from memory. The courtyard remained a showpiece, polished, photographed, spoken of with pride. 7 statues, timeless and dignified. But at night, in the hours past midnight when the windows above flickered dark, the courtyard was never empty. Residents whispered of sounds drifting upward, stone grinding faintly, like teeth clenching, water gurgling too loud for its small fountain, a murmur of voices layered beneath the trickle, words indistinct but insistent. Some dismissed it as plumbing. Others avoided their balconies altogether after dark. Once, a maintenance worker entered at dawn and found a wet trail across the tiles, leading from the fountain to the far archway, as though something heavy had been dragged. He reported it to Caro. The manager waved it off, called it condensation, ordered the tiles scrubbed before anyone else could see. And on another morning, a tenant noticed something stranger still. She swore one of the statues, the philosopher with scroll tucked beneath his arm, bore a new detail. At the base of the scroll, carved faintly, was a single word, a name, Whitmore. When she mentioned it, Caro grew pale, ordered her never to repeat it. By the next day, the word was gone, smoothed as though the marble had healed itself. As for Daniel, he stopped visiting the building altogether. He could not bring himself to walk past its gates, could not bear the sight of its clean glass and immaculate garden, but the image of that courtyard haunted him all the same. At night, in dreams, he saw his father kneeling among the statues, whispering to someone just beyond sight. He saw water rising, shadows leaning inward, mouths splitting wider. And always, he saw the poet, the seated figure his father swore was Eleanor, lifting her head at last, opening her eyes, parting her lips to speak. In those dreams, she did not speak to George. She spoke to him, and the words were always the same. "You will join me." He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the certainty that the invitation had not ended with his father. Months later, Ashford Towers received a new tenant, a young woman, drawn to the building's reputation, charmed by its elegance. She moved in without knowledge of its whispers, without memory of the man who had once lived on the 7th floor. On her first night, she wandered down to the courtyard, admiring the circle of philosophers. She counted them aloud, smiling at the perfection of their arrangement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Her eyes lingered on the fountain. She tilted her head, curious. "Strange," she murmured. "I thought there was one more." The courtyard swallowed the words. The fountain trickled on, and the circle of statues, silent as ever, seemed to lean just slightly closer. The womb of concrete. Ava Morgan had always believed that New York would save her. The city was not a place one lived in, not in the sense of comfort or ease. It was a crucible, a machine, a womb of concrete that pressed and squeezed until only the most resilient emerged. She had vowed long ago that she would be one of them, sleek, unbreakable, reborn in glass towers and boardrooms. That vow had cost her Elijah. He had been her first great love, a man with quiet eyes and restless hands that smelled of turpentine and ink, an artist, a dreamer. He believed in things like mornings without alarms, books read aloud in bed, dinners cooked too late at night. For a time, Ava let herself believe in them too. But when the offers came, the promotions, the promises of a life smelted in steel and money, Elijah had become a weight around her ankle. He wanted permanence. She wanted altitude. He spoke of a life together. She spoke of skyscrapers. The night she ended, it was sharp in her memory, not because of cruelty, but because of how simple it had felt. She remembered standing in their tiny apartment with its cracked plaster walls, telling him she could not choose him over her career. His silence was worse than rage. His face had folded inward, and for a moment she thought he might beg. But Elijah had only said, "When you leave, Ava, you won't just lose me. You'll carry me with you." 2 weeks later, he was gone. A rope, a chair, the apartment they had shared turned into a shrine of failure. She did not attend the funeral. She moved into a high-rise with polished floors and views of the Hudson, and she told herself she had shed him like a snake sheds its skin. She told herself many things. Years passed, and Ava remade herself into the woman she had envisioned. She learned how to wield a voice that cut through boardrooms, how to step into spaces men assumed they owned, how to smile without warmth. Her life was a ladder, rung after rung, and she climbed without glancing down. The city rewarded her for it, but the body is a strange betrayer. At 37, she found herself pregnant. She did not plan it. The father was a man whose name mattered only on paper, whose presence she no longer invited. She considered her options carefully, clinically. Termination would be easy, efficient, but something stayed her hand. She told herself it was legacy. She told herself it was strategy, that a child would not undo her but anchor her. She told herself many things. When Luna was born, Ava was prepared for inconvenience. She was prepared for sacrifice, for distraction, for the mess of flesh interrupting the clockwork of her days. What she was not prepared for was silence. The infant did not behave like other children. Nurses whispered, exchanging uneasy glances. Luna rarely cried. She rarely cooed. She lay in her crib staring upward with eyes black as wells, fathomless and unblinking. When she fed, she did so without fuss, gaze fixed not on the bottle or Ava's face but somewhere behind, as if watching a figure only she could see. At first, Ava laughed it off, proud of her daughter's composure. She's calm, she told friends who visited, their smiles uncertain. She's observant, but at night, alone in her high-rise, Ava would sit with the child and feel something shift in the air. Luna's eyes did not wander the way infants' eyes should. They locked, steady and deliberate, pinning Ava with an intensity that belonged not to a newborn but to someone who had already lived, already judged. Sometimes, Ava whispered to her, half amused, half afraid, "What are you staring at?" The child never answered. She only watched. As months slipped into years, Ava built her life around appearances. To colleagues, she was the executive who balanced motherhood with relentless ambition, her heels clicking across marble floors, her voice carrying through glass chambers. To neighbors, she was the solitary figure with a child always in tow, too self-contained to invite questions. But in private, the rhythm of her days bent around Luna's stare. The girl grew without laughter, without the babbling joy Ava had seen in other children. She walked early, but silently. She played with toys not to delight but to dismantle, pulling them apart piece by piece with small, careful hands. At night, Ava would find her daughter standing at the foot of the bed, watching, not fidgeting, not seeking comfort, only watching. More than once, Ava woke with a start to find Luna perched on the chair across the room, still as a photograph, her black eyes glinting faintly in the dark. The silence pressed against her like a hand. It made her think of Elijah, of the way he had looked at her the night she ended it, the hollow depth in his eyes. She remembered his final words, "You'll carry me with you." And for the first time she wondered whether he had meant them not as poetry but as curse. On Luna's 5th birthday, Ava attempted what she thought would be a small rebellion against the silence. She bought a cake, bright with frosting, candles lit. She set it on the table and urged her daughter to blow them out. For a moment the flames reflected in those dark eyes. Then Luna leaned forward, not to blow, but to stare. One by one, the candles guttered, not extinguished by breath, but by some sudden draft that Ava could not place. The silence after was heavier than before. That night, Ava poured herself a drink and sat on the balcony overlooking the Hudson. The city roared beneath her, sirens and horns, the pulse of the life she had chosen. And yet she felt caged, a prisoner in her own apartment, her own choices. Behind her, in the glass door's reflection, Luna stood in the shadows of the living room, unblinking. For the first time, Ava thought of Elijah not with regret but with fear. She thought of the rope, the chair, the stillness of a body that had chosen to end itself. She thought of the child in her home who did not cry, who did not laugh, who only watched, and she whispered into the night, "What are you?" Luna did not answer, but her reflection lingered long after Ava turned away, as though she had always been there, waiting. Children are meant to reveal themselves slowly. They are meant to stumble into language, to discover laughter as though it were a secret hidden inside their ribs. They are meant to surprise their parents with quirks, with joys, with flaws. But Luna revealed nothing. By the time she was 6, her silence had hardened into something less like shyness and more like deliberation. She spoke only when required, brief words that carried no melody. no trace of the sing-song innocence that marked other children her age. Teachers reported that she did not participate in group games. She did not laugh at jokes, did not cry when scolded, did not seek approval or comfort. She only stared. The reports came in hushed tones. "She's bright," they said, "but distant. We've never seen anything like it." Ava nodded and brushed it off, though the words coiled around her at night when she lay awake beneath the gaze of those black eyes. Because what teachers did not see were the small discoveries Ava made in their home. Knives missing from the kitchen drawer, found days later beneath Luna's pillow. A box of sewing needles arranged meticulously on the floor in the shape of a circle. A razor blade tucked inside the pages of a storybook. When Ava demanded to know why, Luna only tilted her head, as though the question itself were foreign. "Do you want to hurt yourself?" Ava asked once, voice unsteady. The child shook her head. "Do you want to hurt me?" Luna's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something far more unsettling, a look of mild amusement, as if the question were unnecessary, the answer already known. Ava tried to enforce order. She locked drawers, hid scissors, threw away anything sharp. But somehow, Luna always found more. Paper clips bent into crude hooks, shards of porcelain chipped from a broken mug, even a splinter of glass once, clenched so tightly in her small hand that blood welled along her palm without a flicker of pain. When Ava tried to clean the wound, Luna snatched her hand away. Then, deliberately, she raised the shard and pressed it against her own skin, dragging it lightly until a faint line appeared. Not enough to cut deep, but enough to leave a trace. "Stop it," Ava snapped, grabbing her daughter's wrist. Luna's eyes met hers, steady, unblinking. For the first time, Ava saw not the detachment of a strange child, but the precision of something older, something patient. And in that instant, Ava remembered Elijah, standing in their apartment years ago, staring at her with those same black, fathomless eyes before he spoke his final words to her. "You'll carry me with you." The memory grew sharper when the biting happened. It was late evening, after a day of endless meetings. Ava returned home drained, shoulders stiff, her mind heavy with figures and deadlines. She wanted only the quiet of her living room, a glass of wine, a brief moment where she might pretend life was her own again. But Luna was waiting. The child stood in the hallway, a shadow against the glow of the kitchen light. Ava sighed, softening despite her fatigue. For once she felt the need to bridge the gulf between them, to offer tenderness. She reached down, arms opening, drawing Luna close. For a heartbeat, the girl allowed it. Her body was small, warm, fragile against Ava's chest. Ava closed her eyes, inhaled the scent of her hair, and almost believed in the possibility of normalcy. Then pain exploded across her wrist. Luna had bitten her, not the tentative bite of a child in play, but a brutal clamp of teeth, sharp and merciless. Ava screamed, wrenching her arm away, staring in shock at the crescent of blood welling from the flesh. The mark was in a place Ava knew too well, the same spot where Elijah had cut himself, years ago, when she had found him slumped in their apartment, the same wound that had defined his ending. Ava staggered back, clutching her arm. "Why?" she gasped. Luna licked her lips, slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on her mother. She did not answer. She only stood in silence, eyes glinting with a knowledge far older than her years. That night, Ava could not sleep. She sat at the edge of her bed, the city noise muffled by the thick glass windows, staring at the wound on her wrist. She had cleaned it, bandaged it, but still it pulsed with pain, each throb echoing with Elijah's memory. Was it chance? She asked herself. Coincidence. Children bite, children lash out, but the placement, the precision, the way her daughter's eyes had lingered afterward, as if savoring the resemblance. The apartment seemed to close around her, its concrete walls pressing tight, a womb not of safety but of confinement. She rose, pacing from room to room, the silence of the place unbearable, and wherever she turned, she felt those eyes upon her. When at last she dared to peek into Luna's room, she found the child not asleep but sitting upright in bed, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching, always watching. For the first time since her daughter's birth, Ava felt fear not of what Luna might do, but of what she already was. The days that followed blurred into unease. Ava found herself retreating from home, staying later at the office, filling her hours with tasks that kept her away. Yet even among colleagues, in the boardroom, she could not shake the sense of being observed. She would glance at the glass walls of the conference room and swear a pair of dark eyes stared from the reflection. She would check her phone and find the camera open without her touching it, the lens catching her face as though someone else had been watching through it. Sleep became impossible. She dreamed of Elijah's voice, echoing in stairwells, in elevator shafts, whispering from the hum of the city itself. In those dreams, he never appeared whole. Sometimes he was rope tightening against her wrist. Sometimes he was a shadow standing over the crib. Sometimes he was only the glint of eyes in the dark. But always, he was there. And each time she woke, Luna was closer, by her bed, by her chair, by the balcony door, silent, waiting. One evening, Ava found herself standing in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her face was sharper now, lines of exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. She touched her wrist where the bite still marked her, the scar darkening like a bruise that refused to fade. She remembered Elijah's hand, limp against the floor, the pool of red seeping outward. She remembered his words, "You'll carry me with you." And she whispered into the mirror, "Are you him?" The silence answered. But she felt it a shift in the air, a tightening of the room, as though the walls themselves had leaned closer to hear. When she turned, Luna stood in the doorway, small, still, her black eyes fixed unblinking on her mother. That night, Ava locked her bedroom door. She told herself it was precaution, that she needed rest, that children tested boundaries. But deep within, she knew it was not protection she sought, but distance. She lay awake for hours, every creak of the building magnified, every siren from the streets below, echoing like Elijah's voice, carried upward through concrete. When sleep finally came, it was shallow, fragile, and in the half-light before dawn, she woke to a sound. Not knocking, not scratching, but breathing. Slow, steady, inches from her ear. Her eyes flew open. The door was still locked, the room empty. Yet she swore she felt the warmth of another presence beside her bed, leaning close, whispering without words. She turned her head, trembling. Nothing, only shadows. But when she rose to check the door, she found the lock undone. By morning, Ava was certain of only one thing. The distance she had fought for was gone. The city, her fortress of concrete and ambition, had become a cage. And within it, her daughter was no longer simply a child. She was a vessel, a shadow, a continuation of what Ava thought she had abandoned years ago. She could not yet admit it aloud, but the thought grew sharper with each hour. Elijah had not left. He had only changed his shape. Ava began to understand that what terrified her was not the silence itself, but the deliberateness of it. Silence in children was supposed to be clumsy, accidental, the mark of shyness or caution. But Luna's silence had the texture of intent. It was the stillness of someone who was waiting, measuring, storing knowledge for later use. Each pause between her words felt chosen. Each look carried meaning. Ava found herself rehearsing her own sentences carefully, afraid of what her daughter might make of them. The apartment took on a different quality. Its walls, once a fortress of glass and concrete, now pressed in like a chamber built to contain something neither of them had asked for. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to deepen into a whisper. The tick of the radiator bled into the rhythm of a heartbeat. Even the lights, bright and clinical, seemed to flicker in subtle sync with Luna's gaze. It was in these walls that Ava began to find the evidence. A shoebox hidden beneath Luna's bed, filled not with toys but with sharpened objects. Paper clips twisted into hooks, screws stolen from the back of furniture, the blade from a pencil sharpener pried out with patience. There were scraps of Ava's own possessions, among them a strand of her hair coiled like thread, the metal key to her desk drawer, a photograph torn from a frame with her face carefully scratched out. Ava confronted her once. She held the shoebox in her hands and demanded, "Why? Why do you keep these?" Luna blinked, then tilted her head with the faintest hint of a smile. "They belong here." "Here, where?" Ava pressed. Her daughter tapped her own chest, lightly, almost tenderly. "Inside." The words were not the voice of a child. They landed in Ava's stomach like stones. From then on, Ava grew wary of touching anything in her home. She inspected her pillow before resting her head, checked the soles of her shoes before stepping out. searched the bathroom cabinet each morning to make sure nothing had been tampered with. Yet still she found her skin marked in the mornings. Faint scratches on her forearm, small cuts on her ankle. She did not know whether Luna had inflicted them while she slept, or whether she had done it herself in some fugue she could not recall. Once she woke with blood in the sink. Her toothbrush lay on the counter beside her, its handle sharpened into a point. She could not remember doing it. She could not remember anything at all between midnight and dawn. She began to dread sleep. It was Elijah who haunted her in those hours of wakefulness. Not his face, not even his voice in full, but fragments. A laugh pressed into her ear as she turned corners, a half-finished sketch appearing in the condensation of her bathroom mirror. Once she swore she smelled turpentine in the hallway, the sharp tang cutting through the sterile air of the apartment. And always, Elijah's last words returned to her, threaded through the silence like an anchor. "You'll carry me with you." Sometimes, in the depths of night, she would wake to find Luna standing at the foot of her bed. The child's lips would move, whispering. Ava could not hear the words, but she could read them in the dim light. "I am still here." The moment that shattered her came on a Sunday afternoon. She had left Luna at the table with crayons, trying to coax some ordinary childhood behavior from her. Ava returned to find the paper covered not with colors but with rows of words, written in a hand far too steady for a 6-year-old. The sentences repeated, over and over. "She left me. She left me. She left me." Ava stared, throat dry. "Where did you learn this?" Luna looked up, her dark eyes glinting. "From you." The words nearly broke her. She had not said them aloud, but she had thought them, long ago, the night she walked out of Elijah's apartment. And now here they were, written in childish scrawl but with an adult certainty. Ava ripped the paper from the table, crumpled it, and tossed it into the trash. Her hands shook so badly she could not stand. Luna only watched, her lips curling into that almost smile again, as if she had won something. The more Ava tried to reclaim control, the more the city betrayed her. Elevators stalled between floors, doors jammed in their frames. Sirens outside the building rose into an unbearable pitch whenever she passed windows. Even the street itself seemed to shift, shadows moving against her in ways she could not name. She began to feel that New York itself, this womb of concrete that had raised her ambition, that had nurtured her hunger, had turned hostile, conspiring with the child she had borne against her. One night she dreamed of Elijah's voice echoing through the elevator shaft. It was not despairing but triumphant. "You thought you could leave me behind. You thought concrete could bury me, but blood carries further than walls." She woke gasping to find Luna sitting in the corner of her bedroom, a pair of scissors in her lap. She had not cut anything. She simply held them, turning them slowly in her small hands, the metal catching the light like a signal. Ava could not speak. She could only watch, heart hammering, until the child calmly set the scissors down and walked out without a word. That was when Ava began to plan. She told herself it was practical, that she needed help, that her daughter might benefit from distance, from family. But deep inside she knew the truth. She wanted to rid herself of Luna, to place her somewhere else, anywhere else, so that the eyes that were not her daughter's would no longer watch her every breath. She thought of her mother's house upstate, the creaking farmhouse surrounded by fields. It was quiet there, far from the city's pulse. She imagined Luna fading into that countryside, dissolving into rural silence, no longer fed by the concrete womb that had given her life. She imagined herself free again, restored to ambition, to the clarity she had once wielded like a blade. The thought became an obsession. She began to mention it casually to Luna, testing the reaction. "Would you like to visit Grandma? You could stay there for a while." The girl said nothing. She only stared. Once, Ava pressed further. "It might be good for you, to have space, to rest." Luna's lips parted, and for the first time in weeks she spoke more than a sentence. "You left him. Now you want to leave me." The words landed like a stone in Ava's chest. Her knees nearly buckled. "How do you know that?" she whispered. But Luna had turned back to her toys, silent once more. From that moment, Ava knew the decision was already made. It was no longer about choice, but survival. She booked the ticket. She packed the bags. She told herself it was temporary, but every nerve in her body knew it was exile. She would send the child away before the city devoured her whole. And yet, even as she folded clothes into a suitcase, she felt the eyes on her back. She turned, and there was Luna standing in the doorway, hair falling over her face, gaze fixed with a patience that chilled Ava to her marrow. The child said nothing. She did not need to. The silence itself was promise enough. That night, Ava could not sleep. She sat upright in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the building. The radiator ticked in rhythm, a low chant. The concrete walls seemed to breathe. And from the other room came the faint scrape of something sharp against wood, steady, deliberate, like a message being carved one stroke at a time. When Ava could bear it no longer, she rose and went to Luna's room. The child was asleep in her bed, her small chest rising and falling evenly. On the desk beside her lay a piece of wood, the underside of a drawer, pried out. Across it, carved in uneven letters, was a sentence that froze Ava where she stood. "The keys are already mine." Ava pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself. She could not breathe. The apartment loomed around her, vast and suffocating. Concrete pressed close. A womb turned prison. Her daughter lay still in bed, her lips parted faintly, in what might have been a smile. And for the first time, Ava admitted to herself what she had always feared. She had not birthed a child at all. She had given the city its vessel, given Elijah his passage back, given her own betrayal flesh and form. The walls hummed, the concrete pulsed, and Ava realized the womb she had trusted to save her was preparing to deliver her ruin. The night before departure should have brought Ava relief. The bags were packed, the arrangements made, the car scheduled to take them to the train. Her mother had promised to meet them at the station upstate, arms ready, voice warm, a kind of sanctuary Ava had not allowed herself to need for years. By this time tomorrow, she told herself, Luna would be in a different house, under a different roof, where the silence could dissolve into the distance. Yet relief did not come. The apartment pressed tighter than ever, its walls damp with unseen breath. The concrete seemed to listen, to thrum faintly in time with her pulse. Ava moved through the rooms like a prisoner on the last night of sentence. Every shadow stretched long, every sound magnified. She poured herself wine and could not drink it. She drew the curtains and could not close them fully. She told herself to sleep and found her body rigid with anticipation, as though waiting for a verdict. Luna, as always, was quiet. She had eaten her dinner without comment, bathed without complaint, and slipped into bed with the same eerie composure she had carried since infancy. No fuss, no resistance. If Ava had not known better, she might have thought her daughter indifferent to what tomorrow would bring. But she did know better, because when Ava lingered in the doorway, watching the still form beneath the blankets, Luna's eyes flicked open, not wide, not startled, only a measured adjustment, as though she had been awake all along. She stared at her mother for a long, unbroken moment. Then her lips moved. Ava could not hear the words, but she saw them. Shapes formed with deliberate precision, repeated once, then again. "Don't leave me." The whisper was silent, but Ava heard it in her bones. She shut the door and fled to her room, pressing her back against it, chest heaving. "Tomorrow," she whispered aloud. "Tomorrow she'll be gone." But even as she said it, the words rang hollow. Sleep came in fragments. Ava drifted in and out, each time surfacing to new unease. The sound of drawers sliding, the faint click of metal, the subtle shift of weight on the floorboards. She told herself she was dreaming, that exhaustion distorted everything, that the mind makes monsters from shadows. Yet each time she opened her eyes, she felt the impression of being watched. At one point she sat upright, heart hammering, certain someone had spoken into her ear. The voice was low, male, tinged with familiarity. She could not remember the words, only the intimacy of them. Elijah. The name pressed against her throat, but she would not speak it. Near midnight, she heard the whisper clearly for the first time. Not imagined, not dreamed, but carried on the air itself, thin and wavering like a thread pulled through concrete. Ava, her name, stretched long, intimate, spoken not in Luna's high tone but in Elijah's voice. She froze, her hand halfway to the lamp. The sound came again, closer, curling along the walls, slipping through the cracks. Ava. She rose, trembling, and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was still, but the air was heavy, damp with presence. She moved toward Luna's room, compelled, unable to stop herself. The door was ajar. Inside, the child sat upright in bed, her small frame haloed by the faint city light seeping through the blinds. Her lips moved slowly, shaping words that did not belong to her, and from them, Elijah's voice emerged, raw and distorted, as though dragged through layers of stone. "You left me here." Ava's knees weakened. "Elijah?" The child's mouth curled faintly. Her voice deepened, twisted, resonant with something older. "You left me to hang in silence. You climbed your tower of glass, but you carried me in your blood. And now," the girl paused. Her black eyes glinted, bottomless. "I have found my way back." Ava shook her head violently. "No, no, you're not him. You're mine," the voice answered through Luna's lips. "You were always mine." Ava staggered backward, colliding with the wall. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the voice only grew louder, threading through the concrete itself, reverberating in her bones. She could hear it in the pipes, in the radiators, in the foundation. The apartment was alive with him. Luna rose from the bed with slow precision, bare feet silent on the floor. She walked toward her mother, her head tilted, eyes unblinking. With each step, the walls seemed to tighten, the hallway narrower, the air denser. Ava forced herself to speak. "We're leaving tomorrow. You can't stop me. You can't keep me here." The child's lips parted. A laugh emerged, but it was not a child's laugh. It was Elijah's. Dry, bitter, echoing. "You've been in a cage since the day you left me," the voice said. "Concrete is only the shell. I am the marrow. I am the key." Ava's back struck the far wall. She realized with horror that she had cornered herself, the hallway pressing her in like a throat closing. Luna stopped only a foot away. Her small face lifted toward her mother's. For the first time, she smiled fully. It was a smile Ava knew, one that belonged to Elijah on the rare nights he had felt triumphant, when his art had flowed and his words had struck true. A smile of victory. "Tomorrow," he whispered through Luna, "is too late." The lamp in the living room flickered, then went out. The refrigerator hummed louder, grinding like teeth. The concrete groaned with pressure, as though the building itself bent inward. Ava clutched the wall for balance, her breath shallow, her heart racing. "You can't have her," she whispered, meaning Luna, meaning the child that might still be hers beneath the shadow. But the voice answered with cruel certainty. "She was never yours. She was always mine." Luna reached up and placed her small hand on Ava's bandaged wrist, right where the bite had left its mark. Pressure seared through the wound, sharper than teeth, sharper than nails, as if something inside was burrowing deeper. Ava cried out, jerking away, but the hand clung tight, impossibly strong. And then Luna leaned close, lips brushing her ear, voice breaking into a hiss that was not one but two, layered. Elijah and the child, speaking together. "Now I own the keys to your cage." Ava screamed, wrenching free, stumbling into the living room. She grabbed her phone from the counter, but the screen flickered, blackened, and died in her hand. She turned toward the door, but the chain was locked, twisted tight as though welded. The windows rattled but would not open. The concrete walls seemed to pulse, each thrum a heartbeat not her own. Behind her, footsteps padded slowly across the floor. She turned to see Luna standing in the doorway, her hair shadowing her face, her teeth glinting faintly in the dim. She chewed with slow deliberation, and Ava realized with a surge of nausea what filled her mouth. Strands of hair, her own hair. The child swallowed, then smiled again. "You built the tower," the voice said, "but I built the cage." Ava collapsed against the door, sobbing, clawing at the chain that would not give. Around her, the apartment groaned, alive, breathing, a womb of concrete tightening for its final delivery. And in its center stood the child, the vessel, the revenant, the echo of Elijah clothed in flesh. By dawn, the city stirred again, horns blaring, footsteps rushing, lives resuming. To the neighbors of Ashford Towers, the night had been uneventful. To Ava, it had been endless. When she opened her eyes, she was still on the floor by the door, body trembling, wrists bleeding, breath shallow. The chain was gone now, the door unlatched. The apartment seemed ordinary once more, but Luna stood by the window, staring out at the skyline. She turned slowly, her black eyes fixing on Ava. and with a voice that was both hers and not hers, she whispered, "We're not going anywhere." Morning light bled into the apartment like nothing had happened. The city resumed its endless motion, horns blaring, engines coughing, footsteps hurrying across pavements, slick with last night's rain. The Hudson shimmered pale and harmless in the distance. For a moment, Ava thought she had dreamed it all. She sat upright on the floor by the door, muscles aching, throat raw, and wondered if her body had betrayed her mind, if exhaustion had manufactured phantoms. But then she looked at her wrist. The bandage was gone. The bite mark was raw again, the skin ragged and red, as though the wound had reopened in the night. And pressed faintly around it were smaller impressions, not of teeth this time, but of fingers, 5 perfect crescents, as though a child's hand had clamped there with inhuman force. Ava drew her sleeve down quickly, unable to look. Her breath came shallow, ragged. She turned her head toward the window. Luna stood in the exact same place she had been at dawn, her small frame motionless against the light. The girl turned her head slowly, eyes glinting black. "We're not going anywhere." It was not spoken as a plea, not as a threat, but as fact, a fact as solid as the walls pressing close around them. In the days that followed, Ava attempted her escape in small ways. She called the car service again, only to hear static on the line, as though the connection had dissolved the moment she spoke her name. She booked a train ticket online, but the confirmation never arrived, her inbox filling instead with blank emails that bore her own name in the subject line. She even tried to step out with Luna in tow, dragging her suitcase toward the lobby. The elevator doors opened but would not close, the cab trembling, lights flickering until she retreated in panic. The building had decided. The womb had sealed itself. At night, the whispers returned. They came from vents, from pipes, from the very grain of the concrete. Sometimes it was Elijah's voice, steady and familiar, reminding her of the words he had spoken the night she left him. "You'll carry me with you." Sometimes it was Luna's, high and fragile, repeating them with childish emphasis, as though reciting a lesson. And sometimes it was both, layered, inseparable, the echo of 2 voices weaving into one. Ava began to dread silence more than noise. She left the television on, music playing, anything to drown it out. But the voices only threaded themselves through the sound, whispering beneath dialogue, beneath melodies, beneath the static between channels. No volume could mask them. The apartment itself grew hostile. Cracks appeared in the walls where there had been none before. The bathroom mirror fogged without steam, scrawled faintly each morning with words she had not written. "She left me. She left us. The cage is yours now." Once, when she touched the wall with her palm, she swore she felt it throb beneath her hand, a slow pulse answering her heartbeat. The concrete was alive, and she was inside it. And through it all, Luna moved with calm certainty. She no longer hid her objects. She left them arranged deliberately on the kitchen counter, a line of sewing needles, spelling letters, the blade of a knife balanced on its tip, strands of Ava's hair coiled neatly in a bowl. Each night she performed her small rituals, scratching lines into wood, muttering syllables Ava could not understand. Each morning she watched her mother with a gaze that carried not the innocence of a child, but the possession of a captor. The breaking point came 3 nights before Ava stopped resisting entirely. She woke in the dark to the sound of breathing at her ear. Not shallow, not childlike, but deep, male, steady. She opened her eyes to find Luna beside her, standing on the bed, leaning close, her lips parted, and in Elijah's voice she whispered, "You're home." Ava screamed, shoved her back, but the child did not stumble. She only smiled faintly, hair falling across her face, eyes glinting like polished stone. That was the moment Ava knew. This was not a haunting. This was not possession. This was inheritance. The man she had abandoned had made good on his promise. She had carried him with her not in memory, but in blood. The womb of her body had delivered him again, clothed in her child's skin. In the days after, Ava ceased her attempts to flee. She moved through the apartment like a sleepwalker, eating only when Luna pressed food into her hands, sleeping only when exhaustion claimed her on the couch. The city outside receded into abstraction, a distant noise she no longer believed belonged to her. She tried once more to call her mother. When the phone connected, a child's voice answered. "She doesn't live there anymore." The line went dead. The final night arrived without ceremony. Ava sat at the dining table, staring at her reflection in the glass, and realized she no longer recognized herself. The sharp lines of ambition, the polish of her features, had dulled into exhaustion. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with sleeplessness. Her wrist throbbed constantly, the wound never healing, each pulse a reminder of ownership. Luna sat across from her, silent, eating nothing, simply watching. The city's lights glowed behind her like a halo. And then, for the first time in weeks, she spoke with her own voice. "Why did you leave him?" The question struck Ava like a blow. She opened her mouth, closed it again, words choking her. "Because I had to. Because I wanted more." Luna tilted her head. "And now?" Ava pressed her face into her hands. "Now I want out." The girl's laughter filled the room, not Elijah's, not the layered chorus, but her own. High, bright, and yet cruel. When Ava lifted her face, Luna was grinning, wide and deliberate. "You can't leave," she said softly. "You're already inside." That night Ava dreamed one final time. She stood inside a vast hollow, walls pressing close on all sides. Concrete stretched around her like flesh, ribs arching overhead, the sound of a heartbeat echoing through the chamber. At its center stood Elijah, rope still around his neck, smiling faintly. Beside him stood Luna, her small hand tucked into his, her eyes glinting black. "You built this cage," Elijah said, "and now you live in it." When Ava woke, the apartment was silent, too silent. She turned her head and saw Luna standing by the door, clutching something in her fist. Slowly, the girl opened her hand. A ring lay in her palm, Elijah's, the simple band he had worn until the night he died. Ava whispered, "Where did you get that?" Luna placed the ring on the floor, pushed it toward her mother, and smiled. "It was always here." Then she lifted her other hand, revealing a small silver key. She let it fall to the floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the apartment. "Now," she said in Elijah's voice, "I own the keys to your cage." When the neighbors spoke of Ava Morgan months later, they did so cautiously. Some said she had left the city without a word, abandoning her position, her apartment, even her child. Others swore they still saw her face behind the glass of the high-rise, staring down at the street, eyes hollow, body unmoving. Maintenance workers complained of strange noises from her floor, whispers in the vents, footsteps pacing at impossible hours. As for Luna, she was still there. Residents caught glimpses of her in the lobby, small hand trailing along the marble, gaze steady and black. She never smiled. She never cried. She only watched. And when new tenants asked about the unit at the end of the hall, the one Ava had lived in, the doorman would pause before answering. "Still occupied," he would say at last. "Mother and daughter. Never leave. Quiet people." But if anyone lingered outside that door late at night, they would hear it, the faint scrape of nails against concrete, the rhythm of breath pressed into walls, and the echo of a woman's voice whispering from within, "Let me out." The mirror in room 4B. Simon Hale liked to think of himself as a man immune to fear. Fear was for other people, the ones who flinched at shadows and let their imagination gnaw at them in the dark. He wore his bravado like a second skin, an armor he displayed for his small but loyal following online. A delivery driver by night and a storyteller by choice, he had cultivated a persona, the man who laughed at ghost stories, who walked into abandoned buildings live on camera, who grinned at creaking floorboards and rattling chains. "Fear is content," he liked to say, tapping the side of his phone, "and content pays the rent." That night, rain slicked the streets of the city, turning the lamps outside into blurs of yellow flame. Simon had one last delivery on his route, and he was almost disappointed by how ordinary it looked. A hotel, not the glossy chain kind with polished lobbies and glass elevators, but a relic from another time, brick walls weathered, neon sign half dead, the kind of place where history lingered like cigarette smoke. He double-checked the order. A mirror, large and heavy, wrapped in brown paper and twine, its surface padded with layers of cloth. The destination, room 4B. Paid in full. Instructions specific. Deliver after midnight. Simon whistled as he maneuvered the package out of the van. "Classic horror setup," he muttered. "Rain, midnight, creepy old hotel. And me with a mirror. I should be charging extra for ambience. The hotel lobby greeted him with dim lighting and a smell of damp carpet. Behind the desk sat a clerk in a suit too large for him, his eyes fixed on some point just beyond Simon's shoulder. Simon signed the form, cracked a joke, received only a distracted nod. "Fourth floor," the clerk said, his voice flat. "Left at the end of the hall. Room 4B. Simon smirked. "Not 13B? Missed opportunity." No answer. He hauled the mirror into the elevator. The doors shuddered closed, the old machine groaning as it began its slow ascent. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath, the package looming beside him like a silent companion. The overhead light flickered once, briefly painting his reflection in the stainless steel panel. He winked at himself. "Scary stuff," he said to the empty air. "Bet it's haunted. Bet someone's watching me right now." The elevator jolted to a stop. The fourth floor was worse than the lobby. The air smelled of mildew. The wallpaper bubbled and peeling. The hallway stretched too long, the sconces on the wall buzzing faintly with weak light. Simon adjusted his grip on the mirror, muttering into his phone recorder out of habit. "Fourth floor. Hotel of Regrets. I've got a mirror here. Destination room 4B. If I don't make it back, somebody remember to upload this, yeah?" He chuckled at his own joke, but the sound rang oddly hollow. Room 4B waited at the far end, its door marked with tarnished brass numbers. The key had already been left in the lock. Simon nudged the door open with his foot, hauling the mirror inside. The room was empty. No bed, no chairs, only bare floorboards and the faint smell of dust. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that clings to your skin. He frowned, setting the mirror carefully against the wall. "Well," he said aloud, dusting his hands. "Here it is. Big spooky mirror in a big spooky room. You're welcome." For a moment he simply stood there, listening to the quiet. The rain pattered faintly against the glass. Somewhere in the building a pipe groaned. Otherwise, silence. Simon pulled the cloth covering away. The mirror revealed itself slowly, an oval frame tarnished with age, the glass still pristine beneath. He caught sight of himself. Raincoat darkened, hair damp from the night, eyes bright with amusement. He grinned at his reflection. "Hello, handsome. You made it." The man in the glass grinned back. Of course he did, but Simon's grin faltered as he noticed something strange. His reflection blinked half a second late. Not a trick of light, not quite. The delay was there, subtle but undeniable. He leaned closer, peering into the glass, waiting for his reflection to mimic him. He lifted his hand slowly. The image followed, but late. Simon laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Oh, that's new. Guest room, 4B's mirror, runs on hotel Wi-Fi." He chuckled again, louder this time, as if daring the silence to disagree. But the silence did not laugh. It pressed closer, thick and heavy. The mirror stood before him, patient, unblinking, waiting. Simon shook his head, stepping back toward the door. He would leave the mirror, snap a quick photo, mark the delivery complete, and be gone. But something in the air pulled at him, the kind of pull that makes a man lean too close to the edge of a cliff, just to see what waits below. He turned back once more, staring into the glass. His reflection stared back. The delay lingered, a fraction of a beat behind. Simon tilted his head left, then right. The image followed slow, deliberate. And for the first time, Simon wondered if it was really following at all. Simon Hale had never walked away from a dare. His whole brand, his whole stubborn reputation, relied on his willingness to push past the edge of ordinary fear. A creaking stairwell, an abandoned subway tunnel, a hospital basement where nurses whispered of voices he had walked them all, laughing into his phone camera, weaving fear into story. He was the man who turned terror into performance. So, when he noticed the lag in the mirror of room 4B, he did what Simon always did. He leaned into it. He pulled his phone from his pocket, switched on the recorder, and began narrating. "All right, folks, we've got ourselves a glitchy mirror. Haunted, demonic, or maybe this place just can't afford decent glass. Either way, I'm running a little experiment. If my reflection keeps missing cues, we're in for something viral tonight." Ezari. He propped the phone against the wall and sat down cross-legged in front of the mirror. His reflection sat too, a heartbeat late. He waved. The reflection waved. He smiled. The reflection smiled. But the rhythm was wrong, off by that sliver of time that turned comfort into unease. Simon chuckled, though the sound caught in his throat. Looks like I'm watching myself on a live stream with bad connection. Only difference is, there's no camera here, no feed, just me and you. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. So which one of us is behind? The reflection blinked, slower this time. Simon felt a curl of unease in his stomach, but he forced it down. He stretched his arms wide, exhaled loudly, clapped his hands together. The echo sounded sharp in the empty room. His reflection followed, but when it brought its hands together, the sound came not as echo but as silence. The hands met, but no clap rang out. Simon started. His own palms still stung from the collision. The man in the mirror had made the motion, but no sound had followed. He shifted uncomfortably. Okay, that's cute. He rubbed his palms together, forcing a grin. Guess this is the part where the internet tells me I'm faking it. The mirror stared back. Minutes passed. The air in the room felt colder, heavy with the damp weight of a storm. Simon checked the hallway once, thinking he heard footsteps, but the corridor was empty, stretching into silence. He shut the door again, shaking his head. Just me and you. 4B, he muttered. Just me and you. He sat once more before the glass, his bravado thinning into restlessness. He wanted the reflection to slip again, wanted proof beyond the delay, something he could frame and explain, something he could package into a story, because stories, after all, were only safe if they could be told. So he tested it. He leaned left, right, forward. The reflection mimicked him each time, but slower, heavier, like watching a puppet pulled on strings. Then, on impulse, he jerked his head sharply to the side. His reflection followed, lagging, and then stopped. Its head remained turned toward the door. Simon froze. Hey, he said. Eyes on me. The reflection did not turn back. Its gaze stayed fixed to the side, as though something beyond Simon's sight had captured its attention. Slowly, Simon turned his own head, following the line of that gaze toward the door of room 4B. Nothing moved. The door was closed, the knob still, the hall beyond silent. When he looked back, his reflection was smiling. Simon's lips had not moved. He scrambled to his feet, the bravado cracking into nervous laughter. Okay, that's funny. Whoever rigged this mirror, congratulations. You got me. Hidden camera? Screen behind the wall? Great trick. Seriously, the reflection did not stand. It remained seated, its grin fixed. Simon's stomach tightened. His mouth was dry. He turned away, pacing the length of the room, muttering into his phone. This is fine. It's fine. Just a trick of light. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe the rain's getting into my head. He stopped and forced himself to look again. The reflection had risen now, mirroring his stance, but its hands hung limply at its sides, shoulders slouched, face still twisted into that uncanny smile. Simon raised his own hand slowly, cautiously. The man in the mirror did the same this time without lag, perfectly in sync. Simon whispered, "That's better." But then, just as he began to relax, the reflection tilted its head too far. A sharp angle, unnatural, as if the neck had no bone to resist. The smile widened. Simon stumbled backward, heart pounding. All right, enough. I'm done. He grabbed his phone, shoved it into his pocket, and moved for the door. But his hand stalled on the knob. He looked back one last time, compelled by a pull he could not name. The mirror stood calm. His reflection straightened, the unnatural tilt gone. It raised its hand in a mock salute, smirk tugging faintly at its lips, the exact expression Simon wore in his videos when he signed off with a joke. Only this time, Simon was not smiling. He left the room in a rush, pulling the door closed behind him. The hallway smelled of dust and mildew, the lights buzzing faintly above. He forced his breath steady, muttering into the empty air. Content. Just content. I'll cut it together, post it, call it performance art. No one needs to know. Yet as he walked toward the elevator, he could not shake the sensation of being followed, not by footsteps, but by a gaze. He resisted the urge to glance at the dark windows lining the hall. He knew if he looked, he might see another version of himself staring back. At the elevator, he jabbed the button impatiently. The doors creaked open. The cab was empty. He stepped inside, shoulders sagging with relief. The doors began to close, but in the narrowing gap he caught sight of room 4B at the end of the hall. The door he had shut was ajar, and in the darkness of the room, just for a second, the mirror caught the weak hall light. Two figures stood in the glass. Simon squeezed his eyes shut, willing the image away. When the doors opened again in the lobby, he stepped out quickly, eager for the wet air of the street. He thought he would never return. He thought he could leave room 4B behind, tuck the story into his pocket, laugh about it online. But as he reached for the front door, he glanced at his reflection in the pane of glass. And there it was again. The lag. Simon told himself he wouldn't go back. He left the hotel that night, the rain soaking his jacket, his sneakers slapping against the pavement, muttering curses at himself for being spooked like some rookie. He laughed it off into his phone as he walked to the van, telling his unseen audience about the cheap parlor trick upstairs. He swore it would make a funny story later, proof that even he could get jumpy under the right conditions. But as he drove through the city, his mind kept circling the image of the mirror, of the lag, of the smile that wasn't his. He turned the radio up, but the silence between songs stretched too long. He checked his reflection in the rearview, and more than once he thought he saw his lips move a fraction late. By the time he pulled into his building's garage, his bravado had already frayed. He lay awake in bed until dawn, phone in hand, replaying the grainy footage he had captured. The delay was visible. The smile was there. He had proof, but instead of reassuring him, it unsettled him further. He whispered into the dark, "If I don't go back, it wins." By the following night, Simon was back in the hotel lobby. The clerk looked up when he entered, eyes narrowing faintly. "Lost something?" Simon forced a grin. "Yeah, my dignity. Thought I'd check room 4B and see if it's still in there." The clerk didn't laugh. His gaze slid past Simon as though he wasn't there at all. "Room 4B is not occupied." "Lucky me," Simon muttered, hauling his gear toward the elevator. The ride up was worse this time. The elevator groaned like it bore a weight far heavier than him, the bulb above his head flickering so often that his reflection appeared in jagged stutters on the metal panel. His own eyes seemed unfamiliar, too dark. His smile stretched too thin. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched endlessly, the lights humming. Room 4B's door stood ajar. Inside, the mirror waited. Simon closed the door behind him and set his phone on the floor, pointing it toward the glass. He cleared his throat, putting on the voice he used for his videos, casual, mocking, unafraid. Night 2 in the haunted hotel, folks. Guess who's back to prove he's not crazy? Spoiler alert, it's me. He sat cross-legged before the mirror again, his reflection lowering itself seconds after. The lag was worse now, exaggerated, as if the glass were replaying an old tape of him. He raised his hand. The reflection waited, then copied. He smiled. It frowned. Simon's breath hitched, but he covered it with a laugh. "Oh, so now you've got improv skills. Nice." The reflection smiled then, slow and deliberate, revealing teeth too white, too sharp in the dim light. Simon swallowed. "You think you're funny?" His own voice echoed back at him, but not from his throat, from the mirror. Distorted, slowed, as though dragged through water. "You think you're funny?" Simon's stomach dropped. His reflection's mouth hadn't moved in sync with the words, but the voice was unmistakably his. He lunged forward, pressing his palm against the glass, trying to find warmth, some proof it was only glass. The surface was cold, too cold, like touching ice. "Say something else," he demanded. The reflection tilted its head. Then, without Simon speaking, its lips moved. "Who are you?" it asked. The voice was his, but the question wasn't. Simon staggered back, shaking his head violently. No, this is a trick. It has to be a trick." But the room offered no explanation. The air pressed heavy, the shadows stretched deeper, and the mirror waited. His reflection stood calm within, eyes glinting, lips twitching with amusement. Simon dropped into the chair he'd dragged from the hall, his knees weak. He forced himself to steady his breathing. "Fine. If this is the game, I'll play." He leaned forward again, whispering like a conspirator. "What do you want?" The reflection only grinned wider. Simon gritted his teeth, running a hand over his face. "You're me. That's the joke, right? You're me." The reflection nodded once. But then it mouthed something Simon could not hear. He leaned closer, straining to read the movement of his own lips inside the glass. Not me. The words crawled over his skin like insects. He shoved the chair back, the legs screeching against the floorboards. Not me? What the hell does that mean? The reflection did not answer. It turned its head slowly, unnaturally, until its gaze settled on the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. Simon followed the glance but saw nothing, only empty space. When he looked back, the reflection was staring at him again, smiling faintly. Simon's bravado collapsed into anger. He hated the silence, hated the game, hated that he was losing. He pointed at the glass. You're just a trick. You're just my face in bad lighting. You're not real. The reflection's smile widened. Then it blinked. Not once, not twice, but over and over, rapidly, unnervingly. A flutter of lids like a signal. Simon tried to look away but couldn't. His own eyes watered. He blinked reflexively, but his reflection didn't stop. It kept blinking, faster and faster, until the lids vanished, and only two staring black voids remained. Simon's chest heaved. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, and then, just as suddenly, the reflection stilled. Its eyes were normal again, its smile faint, its head tilted, almost gently. Simon heard his own voice, his true voice, trembling. What are you? The reflection whispered, lips barely parting. What are you? He ran. He grabbed his phone, bolted for the door, yanked it open. The hallway stretched too far, lights buzzing like a swarm. He sprinted toward the elevator, heart hammering, throat raw. He jabbed the button, swore under his breath, pressed again and again. When the doors opened, he stumbled inside and punched the lobby button. The elevator lurched downward. He leaned against the wall, clutching his phone, muttering, You're fine. You're fine. Just content. Just content. Just. The panel across from him gleamed faintly, catching his reflection in the dull steel. It smiled. Simon did not. By the time he reached the street, he was shaking. He drove without direction, circling blocks, muttering to himself. He replayed the footage, but the phone screen glitched, static blooming across the image whenever the reflection moved. He deleted the file in frustration, but when he opened his gallery again, the clip was still there. Every time he deleted it, it returned. By dawn, Simon parked outside his own apartment, staring into the rear view. His reflection stared back, expressionless. He raised his hand. The reflection lagged, then lifted its hand too. But just before Simon lowered his, the reflection clenched its fist and held it there. Simon whispered, Not me. The reflection's lips parted into a grin. Simon had promised himself he wouldn't go back a third time. 2 nights were enough, he told himself. He had the footage. He had the story. He could spin the rest into performance and be done with it. But promises made in daylight don't always survive the dark. By midnight, he was back in the lobby of the old hotel, rainwater dripping from his jacket, his face pale and drawn. The clerk didn't look up when Simon entered. He didn't need to. The man only murmured, Room 4B, as if Simon's arrival had been inevitable, as if every step of his return had been written long ago. Simon swallowed the urge to ask how the clerk knew. He didn't want to hear the answer. The elevator moaned beneath his weight, dragging itself upward. The 4th floor greeted him with silence. The hallway longer than he remembered, the wallpaper darker, the bulbs buzzing faintly as though filled with flies. At the far end, Room 4B's door stood open a sliver, waiting. He stepped inside. The mirror filled the room, larger somehow, its tarnished frame like ribs arching around its glass. His reflection was already waiting, standing in the center, lips curled in a grin that Simon's own face did not wear. Simon forced his voice steady. All right, enough games, who are you? The reflection did not answer. It tilted its head, slow and deliberate, its eyes catching the dim light. Simon stepped closer, fists clenched. You hear me? Who are you? The reflection raised a hand, fingers splayed. Simon froze, then raised his own hand reluctantly. The reflection followed, but it moved faster, sharper, its palm slamming flat against the glass with a sound Simon had not made. The vibration rattled the frame, shivered the floorboards. Simon stumbled back, heart hammering. His reflection did not move away. It pressed its face close to the glass, lips stretching into an obscene parody of a smile. Simon whispered, "Not me." The reflection's smile widened. Its lips moved. "Not you." His breath came ragged now. He turned, meaning to leave, but the door behind him had closed. He grabbed the knob and yanked, but it did not turn. He pounded his fist against it, shouted down the hall, but no sound carried beyond the room. Only his own echoes returned. When he turned back, the reflection was laughing silently, shoulders shaking, mouth wide. Simon's anger surged past his fear. "Stop it," he roared, storming toward the mirror. He slammed both fists against the glass. His knuckles burned, but the surface held. The reflection did not mimic him. Instead, it straightened calmly, lifted its hands, and curled them slowly around its own throat. Simon froze. "Don't." The reflection squeezed. Simon's lungs seized. His throat tightened, invisible pressure crushing inward. He staggered, clawing at his neck, gasping for air. His knees hit the floor. His vision blurred at the edges. He could see the reflection's hands digging deeper, could see the veins in its forehead bulging, could feel the exact same agony tearing through him. He croaked, "Please stop." The reflection tilted its head in mock pity, but its grip tightened. Black spots danced before Simon's eyes. His chest convulsed. His body screamed for air. Then, just as his vision tunneled to nothing, the reflection released itself. Air tore into Simon's lungs in a ragged gasp. He collapsed on the floor, coughing violently, throat raw, tears streaming down his face. He touched his neck with trembling hands. No bruises, no marks, nothing but the memory of suffocation. Slowly, he raised his head. The reflection was crouched inside the glass, its face level with his, lips stretched in a grin that belonged to no human mouth. Simon crawled backward, pressing his spine against the far wall. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes, but he couldn't. The mirror pulled at him, demanded attention. His reflection mimicked none of his movements now. It crouched there, still, waiting. Finally, Simon whispered, "What do you want from me?" The reflection blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then its lips moved, shaping words Simon could not hear. He leaned forward, unwilling, desperate. The words formed clearly in the silence. "Let me out." Simon shook his head violently. "No, no, no, no." The reflection's fists slammed against the glass again, harder this time. The frame rattled. A hairline crack splintered across the surface, thin as a spider's thread. Simon screamed, "Stop!" He threw the chair across the room. It struck the mirror and bounced off, the crack spreading wider, branching into jagged lines. The reflection pressed its face against them, grinning through fractured glass. "Let me out." Simon's head spun. The walls seemed to lean inward, the floor tilting beneath him. He pressed his hands against his ears, but the words burrowed through bone, vibrating in his skull. "Let me out." The crack widened. A shard fell, clattering across the floor. For a moment, Simon thought he saw a hand push against the opening, not his own, but something paler, thinner, dripping shadows. He bolted for the door, clawing at the knob. This time it turned. He stumbled into the hall, slamming the door behind him, chest heaving. The hallway was silent, the lights buzzing faintly. He staggered toward the elevator, vision swimming, throat still raw. The button glowed red under his shaking hand. The doors creaked open, but before he stepped inside, he turned, drawn against his will. At the far end of the hall, the door to room 4B hung open once more. And in the darkness he saw the mirror. Cracks webbed its surface. His reflection stood within, waiting. It raised its hand in a mock salute, and smiled. Morning came soft and gray, the storm clouds bruised and heavy above the skyline. In the lobby of the old hotel, the clerk shuffled through a newspaper with mechanical detachment. When the first call came down from the 4th floor, his expression did not change. Someone had found a man in room 4B. Someone said he was not breathing. The clerk nodded once, as though he had expected the news. By the time the police arrived, the hallway was crowded with curious guests. The door to 4B was closed, but the smell of damp and dust seeped from the crack beneath. Officers pushed through, their shoes echoing sharply on the warped boards. Simon Hale lay on the floor, his body twisted awkwardly beside the mirror. His eyes stared upward, wide and glassy, lips parted as though still trying to draw breath. His throat bore no bruises, no fingerprints, no rope, yet his face was blue with asphyxiation. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They checked the room, finding nothing but the mirror, propped against the wall, fractured but whole. Its glass shimmered in the dim light, cracks spreading like veins, but it remained intact. Cause of death looks like strangulation, one murmured. But he gestured to the skin, unmarked, perfect. A photographer entered, his camera flashing. Each burst of light illuminated the mirror's surface, momentarily catching more than just Simon's body. In one frame, an officer swore he saw a shadow standing behind them in the glass, indistinct but present, its outline long and thin. In another, a pale hand seemed pressed against the inside of the crack, fingers clawing outward. When the photos developed later, those images were gone. Only the mirror remained, fractured and silent. One officer leaned close, peering into the spiderweb of cracks. For a moment, he thought he saw his own face staring back at him. Then it blinked, just slightly late. He stumbled back, muttering a curse. The coroner arrived, his gurney squeaking across the floorboards. They zipped Simon into the black bag, his phone clattering to the ground beside him. When an officer picked it up, the screen flickered to life. Video files filled the gallery, each one identical. Simon in front of the mirror, his mouth moving a fraction out of sync. Hundreds of copies, all recorded at the same timestamp. They deleted them. The files returned instantly. Finally, the sergeant snapped the phone shut and slid it into an evidence bag. Enough. Seal the room. By evening, room 4B was empty again. The guests returned to their routines, the hall quiet as if nothing had happened. Only the mirror remained, tilted slightly forward, its fractured glass gleaming faintly in the dim light. The hotel manager arrived at last, a thin man with deep-set eyes. He stared at the officers still lingering near the door. "There is no room 4B, he said flatly. They frowned. "We just pulled a body from it." The manager shook his head. "Room 4B has been sealed for 10 years. The mirror was removed long ago. There should be nothing inside." The officers exchanged glances. "We saw it. We touched it." The manager's face remained expressionless. "Then it has returned." He stepped forward, closing the door firmly, locking it with a key that looked older than the building itself. "Do not open this room again." Of course, the order was not followed. Hotels need revenue. Guests are curious. Stories spread, and stories attract. By the next month, room 4B was quietly rented again, its history buried in paperwork. New tenants came and went, often for only a single night, never staying long enough to question the chill in the air. Those who lingered noticed the mirror, not always immediately, sometimes only as they passed the wall, catching their reflection in the corner of their eye. But once they saw it, they could not stop looking. They would tilt their head. The reflection would tilt too, just slightly late. They would smile. The reflection would not. And before the night was over, they would swear that someone else was standing in the glass behind them, waiting. Simon Hale was buried quietly, his death marked as unexplained. Online, his followers speculated endlessly. Some claimed he had faked it, vanished into the world chasing content. Others swore the footage that leaked shaky, fractured, full of static, was proof he had finally gone too far. In one clip, the last to surface before the account was deleted, Simon sits in front of the mirror in room 4B. His face is pale, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" he asks. His reflection stares back, smiling faintly. Then the video cuts to black. Late one evening, long after the police reports had been filed and forgotten, a housekeeper entered room 4B with mop and bucket. She avoided looking directly at the mirror, but in the edge of her vision she saw movement. She froze, breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to turn her head. The glass was fractured, cracked and veined, but still whole. Her reflection stood there, head tilted, lips curved in a slow smile, except she wasn't smiling. She dropped her mop and fled, leaving the bucket overturned, water pooling across the floor. By morning, no one mentioned it. By morning, the mirror was just a mirror again. And yet it waits. The glass glimmers faintly in the dark, its cracks shifting like veins, its surface deeper than reflection. Those who dare to look too long find themselves staring not at themselves, but at something older, patient, hungry, and if you listen closely, when the hall is quiet and the rain drums against the windows, you can hear it whisper, "Let me out." And the black soil boy. They say some children carry the earth inside them, that they drag it behind wherever they go, not in shoes or backpacks, but in their skin, in their breath, in the way they never quite belong. Helen Caro never believed in whispers like that. She was a teacher, a woman grounded in order and routine. 27 years of chalk dust on her sleeves, the rhythm of bells marking out her days, the steady tide of children growing, stumbling, and moving on. She had learned to read faces, to hear the undercurrent in laughter, to recognize which children would thrive and which would fold under the world's weight. She believed in behavior, not in myths. That was before Tobias stepped into her classroom. It was the first Tuesday of September, the air heavy with the dampness of recent rain. Helen had been fighting a cough that clung stubbornly to her chest, but she carried on, as she always did, her voice crisp, her notes neat on the board. She heard the knock at the door just after roll call. The principal ushered in a boy she had never seen. Thin, shoulders stooped, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. His clothes hung loose on his body, clean enough but faded, as though they had belonged to someone older before him. His hair was damp with sweat that plastered it to his forehead, and beneath it all was the smell. It hit Helen first sharp, wet, metallic, like roots pulled from heavy soil, like mushrooms rotting in damp cellars. She swallowed a wince, forced her smile steady. "Class," she said. "This is Tobias. He'll be joining us for the term." A murmur rippled through the students. She saw hands lift subtly to cover noses, saw smirks exchanged. Tobias lowered his head, saying nothing, and walked to the desk at the back that had been left empty since last year. As he sat, a faint streak of dark earth smudged onto the floor beneath his shoes. Helen told herself she imagined it. By mid-morning, the room was restless. Snickers rose whenever Tobias shifted in his seat. Papers slid toward him with crude sketches. A pig, a compost heap, flies buzzing. Helen intercepted one, crumpled it quickly, and scolded the culprits. But even she could not deny the air had changed. A damp heaviness clung to the classroom. Every time Tobias leaned forward, drops of sweat slid down his temples and landed dark against his notebook. The smell of earth, acrid and sour, thickened until it sat on the tongue. At lunch, when she stepped into the staff lounge, another teacher wrinkled her nose. "That new boy," she muttered. "He smells like the gym locker left in the rain." Helen snapped back more sharply than she intended. "He's just nervous. Children sweat. They grow into themselves." The other teacher raised an eyebrow. "Nervous doesn't smell like that." Helen said nothing more. But as she returned to her classroom, she caught sight of Tobias again, standing alone at the edge of the playground. He wasn't playing. He wasn't speaking. He simply stood with his arms at his sides, head bowed, as if listening to something beneath the soil. The other children avoided him, circling far from where he stood. When the bell rang, Helen noticed his hands. His nails were rimmed with dirt, black and damp, though she hadn't seen him touch the ground. The days that followed did not make things easier. Tobias never spoke unless directly asked, and even then his voice was barely audible, cracked as if unused. His sweat stained the pages of his work, leaving damp blotches that spread like ink. Wherever he walked, a faint trail of soil followed small flakes on the floor, streaks on the edge of his desk, smudges on the books he touched. The other students grew crueler. Notes passed like contagion. Tobias the compost heap. Tobias the swamp. Tobias the grave. Helen disciplined them, lectured them on kindness, but even she found herself drawing shallow breaths at the front of the room, her throat burning with that strange, cloying odor of earth. One afternoon, she asked him to stay behind after class. When the room was empty, she approached his desk carefully. "Tobias," she said gentler than before, "is everything all right at home? Do you need help?" He lifted his eyes slowly. They were dark, deep, with a sheen that caught the light oddly. For a moment she thought she saw moisture pooled in them. Not tears, but something thicker, soil-colored. "I'm fine," he whispered. His voice sounded damp, as though filtered through wet leaves. Helen hesitated. She wanted to press, to offer some avenue of trust, but something in his gaze unsettled her. It was not defiance. It was not even sadness. It was patience, the kind that waits beneath the ground, biding its time. She dismissed him, her heart pounding. That evening, she stayed late to grade papers. As she gathered her things, she noticed the janitor sweeping near Tobias's desk. The man paused, frowning, and scraped his broom hard against the wood. When Helen approached, she saw why. The underside of the desk was streaked black, as if earth itself had seeped up through the grain. The janitor muttered, "Kids tracking mud in from somewhere." But the streaks were damp, and when Helen leaned closer, the smell rose sharp and undeniable. Not mud, not dust, the smell of something that had been buried too long. She went home unsettled, her cough thickening, her skin prickling with a dampness that refused to leave. By the end of the week, the children began refusing to sit near him. The principal called Helen into his office, concerned about hygiene and discipline. She defended Tobias fiercely, but her voice wavered as she did so. She could not forget the smell, the soil smears, the silence that followed wherever he went. On Friday, she caught him in the hallway before dismissal. He stood by the lockers, motionless, while other students streamed past in noisy packs. In his hand, clutched tight, was a lump of black earth. It crumbled between his fingers, staining them dark. Helen whispered, "Where did you get that?" He looked at her, eyes hollow, and murmured, "It's always been here." Her skin crawled. She watched as the last of the soil slipped through his fingers, falling to the tiles below. But when she blinked, it was gone. The floor was clean. That night, Helen lay awake in bed, her chest heavy, her sheets damp though the air was cool. She thought of Tobias's words, of his eyes, of the smell that seemed etched into her own lungs. She rose at midnight, went to the bathroom sink, splashed water on her face. When she lifted her head, she froze. Her hands were smeared black, soil clinging to her skin as though she had been digging. She stared in horror, rubbing them beneath the faucet until the water ran clear. It was only then she realized she could still smell it, faint but sharp, the scent of damp earth, clinging, waiting. The following week at school carried a tension Helen could feel in the marrow of her bones. Every classroom has its balance, its fragile arrangement of loyalties, cruelties, and silences. With Tobias in the mix, that balance tilted, and she could sense it unraveling in the whispering corners, in the way laughter sharpened whenever he entered the room. The children had always been quick to scent weakness. They circled Tobias like crows, their mockery practiced and cruel. They pinched their noses theatrically whenever he walked past. They dropped clumps of dirt onto his desk when they thought Helen wasn't looking. They called him Swamp Boy, Grave Breath, the Compost Kid. Helen tried to stamp it out. She scolded, punished, wrote names on slips for detention. But discipline only seemed to drive the cruelty deeper underground, where it fermented into something meaner. The children had learned to hold their laughter until her back was turned. They had learned to torment in whispers, in subtle pushes, in looks that cut sharper than words. Tobias bore it all with silence. He did not defend himself, did not cry, did not even look at them. He carried the odor of damp earth and rot with him wherever he went, and that was enough. Mark, of course, was the loudest. He had always been a ringleader, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with the kind of confidence that feeds on weakness. Tobias was an irresistible target. At first it was mockery, muttered comments, cruel laughter. Then it turned physical. Mark would accidentally bump Tobias's desk, knocking his books to the floor. He would shove past him in the hallway, leaving soil-like smears on the lockers Tobias had touched. One afternoon, Helen caught Mark holding his sleeve over his nose, leaning toward his friends with exaggerated disgust. "It's like he sleeps in a grave," he sneered. "Maybe that's why he smells like one." The boys laughed. Tobias sat silent at his desk, hands folded, the faint streak of black soil under his fingernails catching the light. Helen snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "Mark, that's enough." "Oh," the boy rolled his eyes but subsided, grinning faintly as if the punishment itself was proof of his victory. Helen saw Tobias glance up at her then, just for a heartbeat. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a heavy patience, as if all of this was expected, as if he had lived it before. The turning point came on a Wednesday, when the air hung heavy with humidity and tempers frayed. The class was restless that morning, pencils drumming, chairs squeaking. Helen was at the board when it happened. Tobias, seated at the back, suddenly doubled forward with a shudder. His shoulders convulsed once, twice. Then he sneezed a wet, violent sound that echoed through the room. The children erupted into laughter, covering their faces, groaning in exaggerated disgust. But the laughter cut short when they saw where it had landed. Mark sat frozen, his cheek and mouth spattered. He leapt to his feet with a roar of anger, wiping furiously at his skin. "Gross! He spit on me!" Helen rushed to intervene, her voice raised, sharp. "That's enough. Sit down, Mark." But Mark's face was pale beneath his anger, his hands trembling. He opened his mouth to retort and gagged instead, his expression twisting. He stumbled back into his chair, his breath coming fast and shallow. The odor thickened, not the faint background stench that followed Tobias, but stronger, sharper, the smell of wet soil overturned in summer heat, of roots rotting in stagnant water. It poured off Mark in waves, filling the classroom until children began coughing, fanning themselves, eyes watering. Helen felt it catch in her own lungs, thick and damp. She coughed into her fist, struggling to steady her voice. Class dismissed. Now, the children fled in a rush, covering noses, whispering in alarm. Only Tobias remained seated, hands folded neatly, as if nothing had happened. Mark sat hunched over his desk, sweating profusely, his shirt clinging to his back. His nails tapped against the wood, and Helen noticed with a jolt that their tips looked darker, as though stained. She dismissed him gently, urging him toward the nurse's office, but he pushed her hand away. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his face was ashen, his skin gleaming with sweat. He staggered into the hall, leaving faint black smudges on the doorframe where his hand had brushed. Helen remained behind, the classroom silent except for the faint tick of the clock. She sank into her chair, throat raw from coughing, chest tight with unease. Her eyes drifted to Tobias. He sat perfectly still at his desk, his gaze fixed on her. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she whispered, "What happened just now?" Tobias tilted his head. His lips parted faintly, and she thought she saw a smear of soil at the corner of his mouth, like earth exhaled in place of breath. "It grows," he said softly. The words chilled her to the bone. That night, Helen could not rest. She coughed until her ribs ached, the smell of damp soil lingering in her nostrils no matter how many windows she opened. Her dreams were thick with images of children sinking into black mud, their nails clawing at the air as the ground swallowed them whole. When she woke in the pale hours before dawn, she found dirt beneath her fingernails. She scrubbed until her skin was raw. The next day, Mark did not come to class. The nurse sent word that he had been sent home with fever. By afternoon, rumors spread. Some said he was covered in rashes. Others said his nails were turning black. Helen caught a group of girls whispering in the hallway. "My brother saw him," one said. "He smelled like the swamp, just like Tobias." The other girl shivered. "What if it spreads?" Their eyes flicked toward Helen before they scattered, as if afraid to be caught speaking the truth aloud. When Helen returned to her classroom, she found Tobias already seated, though the bell had not yet rung. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile. Her cough tightened in her chest. She could smell it stronger now, clinging to him, clinging to the walls, clinging to her own breath. She pressed a hand to her chest, whispering to herself, "It's just a boy, just a boy." But the words no longer convinced her. The school's air grew heavier in the days that followed. It wasn't just the weather, though the skies remained a low, unbroken gray, pressing humidity down into the classrooms. It was something in the way whispers spread faster than facts, the way children flinched when Tobias passed them, the way every locker he brushed seemed to acquire a dark smudge that no janitor's rag could quite erase. Mark did not return to school. By the second day, Helen overheard a boy say he had seen Mark's mother dragging a mattress to the curb, her face white, her mouth pressed in a line so tight it looked carved in stone. Another child whispered that Mark's nails had gone soft and peeled away, replaced by brittle black growths that cracked whenever he moved his hands. Helen silenced them when she could, but the rumor had already rooted deep. They called it the swamp sickness. They called it Tobias's curse. Each nickname hardened Tobias's isolation. He walked through the halls like a shadow, his shoulders stooped, his eyes downcast. The smell followed him, unmistakable, the thick, fungal odor of damp soil, of compost steaming in the heat. and yet no one ever saw him dirty. His clothes were always the same, faded set, his hair always damp with sweat but not visibly caked with mud. Only his hands betrayed him, the dark crescents beneath his nails, the faint grit that fell in specks across his desk whenever he shifted. Helen noticed it everywhere now. She would find streaks of soil on papers he turned in, on the floor beneath his chair, even once on the hem of her own skirt when she brushed past him. She had scrubbed it away furiously, but the scent lingered. One afternoon, after the final bell, she lingered by the window while the last of her students left. The rain had begun again, drumming steadily against the glass. Tobias remained at his desk, unmoving, as though he had not heard dismissal. "Tobias," she said gently, "it's time to go home." He looked up at her, his eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "I don't go home," he murmured. The words startled her. "What do you mean?" He lowered his gaze again, his thin shoulders shuddering with what might have been a laugh or a sob. "Home is already here." Helen felt her skin prickle. She crossed the room, meaning to put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but stopped short when she saw the soil beneath his desk. It wasn't a smear this time. It was a mound, small, but unmistakable, as if he had been sitting above a patch of ground instead of tile. She blinked, and when she looked again, it was gone. Only the faint stain of damp remained. Tobias rose without another word and left the classroom. She watched him disappear down the hall, her throat tight, her lungs burning faintly with the smell he left behind. By the end of the week, Mark's absence had become more ominous. Parents spoke in hushed tones when they dropped their children off. Helen saw one mother clutch her daughter's arm and whisper fiercely, "Stay away from him. Do you hear me? Stay away." The children obeyed. No one came near Tobias now, not even to jeer at him. He was a void at the back of the class, a space carved out by fear. Helen tried to bridge it, tried to ask if he was all right, if he needed help. But every word felt thin against the weight that pressed down whenever he looked at her. Her own health was faltering. The cough that had begun as irritation now rumbled in her chest, thick and wet. She woke in the night drenched in sweat, her sheets damp, the air of her bedroom heavy with the faint smell of soil. Once, in the early hours, she rose and stumbled to the bathroom, turning on the light. Her reflection startled her. Her face was pale, her hair plastered damp to her temples, her eyes shadowed. She lifted her hand to her cheek, and her nails scraped faintly against grit. She pulled her hand back and stared. The tips of her fingers were darkened, stained as if she had been digging in a garden with bare hands. She scrubbed them until the skin reddened, but she could not rid herself of the faint black crescents beneath her nails. On Monday, the principal called her into his office. He looked older than she remembered, his hands wringing a pen between them. "Helen," he said, "there are concerns. Parents are talking. They say a sickness is spreading, and they're blaming Tobias." Helen's stomach tightened. "He's just a child." The principal's eyes darted toward the closed door. "A child who seems to trail dirt wherever he goes. A child who, well, you've noticed the smell." She said nothing. He sighed. "For now, keep him apart. Limit his contact. We don't want panic." Helen left the office with a sickness deeper than her cough. "Keep him apart." The words sat heavy, as though Tobias were already something other. That afternoon, the storm broke. Rain hammered the windows, thunder rolled. The children were restless, anxious. Tobias sat silent at the back, his hands folded neatly on his desk. Then, in the middle of math, a girl shrieked. Helen rushed to her, heart pounding. The girl pointed at her desk. Beneath her hand, where Tobias had brushed past earlier, black grit clung to her skin. She scrubbed furiously with her sleeve, sobbing. The other children erupted into panic, some leaping from their chairs, others pressing against the walls, their eyes fixed on Tobias as though he had already infected them all. Helen shouted over the din, trying to restore order. "Enough. Sit down, all of you." Her words cut through, but only just. The children huddled together, staring. Tobias remained unmoved, his eyes lowered, his face damp with sweat. Helen dismissed class early. As the children fled, she stayed behind with him once more. She waited for him to speak, but he only sat in silence. Finally, she whispered, "What is happening to them?" Tobias lifted his head. His eyes met hers, deep and black, and for a moment she felt as though she were falling into them, down into damp earth, roots coiling around her ankles. "They don't like the smell," he said softly. "But the smell comes first. Then the soil. Then the worms." Helen's breath caught. "Worms?" He gave the faintest nod. "They're already here." She left school that day shaken to her core. Her cough racked her chest, her skin clammy with sweat. As she walked home through the rain, she felt the earth soft beneath her feet, as though it were giving way. She imagined roots clutching her ankles, pulling her down. That night, she dreamed of Mark. He stood in the center of her classroom, his face pale, his shirt soaked with sweat. He opened his mouth to speak, but only soil poured out, black and wet, spilling across the floor until it swallowed him whole. When she woke, she found streaks of dirt across her sheets. Helen Caro had always been a practical woman. She taught her lessons, graded her papers, walked home through rain or snow with the same reliable stride. But by the time the leaves began to turn that October, she no longer trusted the ground beneath her feet. It felt soft, loose. It shifted when she walked, as though there were something hollow beneath it, waiting to open. Her cough had worsened. She hid it from her colleagues, muffling it behind handkerchiefs, telling herself it was only autumn air. But at night she woke drenched in sweat, her sheets damp, her hands dark with streaks of soil she swore she hadn't touched. Her bathroom sink was clogged twice in a single week, the pipes gurgling thick with black grit that no plumber could explain. She told herself it was coincidence, but she knew better. And Mark, the boy who had mocked Tobias most cruelly, had not returned to school. Rumors spread faster than Helen could silence them. His skin had broken out in lesions. His nails had blackened entirely. His sweat smelled like earth, so thick his mother had moved him to a hospital. Others whispered he never made it that far, that he was buried already. Helen no longer knew what to believe. She only knew one thing. Tobias was at the center of it. One gray afternoon, when the rain had eased into mist, Helen left school and walked past the bus stop. She did not know what drew her, only that her steps carried her beyond her usual path, toward the edge of town where houses thinned. She had asked Tobias once where he lived, and he had only said near the orchard, in the old house with the vines. The orchard was long abandoned, its trees twisted and black, their fruit rotting where it fell. At the far end stood a house that leaned in on itself, its siding cracked, its porch sagging. Ivy climbed the walls, not green but dark and brittle, clinging like veins. Helen's chest tightened as she approached. The air was heavy with that smell-damp soil, roots turned inside out. She raised her hand to knock, but the wood was so soft her knuckles sank slightly into it. The door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the house was dim. Curtains hung damp against the windows, dripping faintly onto the warped floorboards. The walls were streaked with black moisture, the wallpaper sagging as though eaten away from behind. Everywhere she looked was soil not tracked, not spilled, but growing. It bulged up through the cracks in the floor, spilled across the thresholds, clung in clumps to the legs of furniture. The smell was suffocating, metallic and wet, as if she had stepped into the hollow of the earth itself. She called out softly, "Tobias?" Her voice was swallowed instantly, muffled by the heavy air. There was no answer. Helen moved cautiously through the house, her shoes sinking slightly into the softening boards. In the kitchen, the counters were covered with black grit. A plate lay overturned in a sink clogged with earth. Roots sprouted from the drain like veins, pulsing faintly as though alive. Her stomach turned, but she pressed on, her cough tearing at her chest. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step groaning. The banister slicked beneath her hand. At the top, the hallway stretched into shadow. Doors sagged open on either side, their frames swollen with damp. She followed the smell, stronger now, metallic and sharp. It led her to the bathroom. The door was half closed. Ayla hesitated. Her heart pounded, her breath came ragged. She pushed the door gently with her fingertips. The bathroom was dim, the single bulb overhead flickering weakly. The tiles were cracked, black veins spiderwebbing across them. Soil filled the bathtub to its rim, clotted and damp, crawling with thin red roots, and in the center of it sat Tobias. At first she thought he was simply covered in dirt, as if he had buried himself there like some strange child's game. But then she saw his skin. It hung loose on his small frame, slick with sweat, peeling in ragged strips. Beneath it was not muscle, not bone, but dark clumps of earth packed tight, glistening with moisture. Something moved within it, long, slick forms, shifting and writhing, burrowing deeper. Worms. Tobias turned his head slowly toward her. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen, pupils wide, reflecting nothing. As he opened his mouth, soil spilled across his lips, falling in wet clumps onto his chest. Helen staggered back, one hand pressed to her mouth. She gagged on the stench, on the sight. His voice came damp and thick, as though pulled through the soil itself. "You came." Helen's legs trembled. "Tobias," she whispered, her throat raw. What are you?" He blinked slowly. A piece of his cheek sloughed away, sliding down to reveal the shifting earth beneath. "I am what waits," he murmured. "I am what grows where you do not look." Her breath hitched. "You're sick. You need help." The faintest smile tugged at his cracked lips. "Not sick. Alive. More alive than you." She shook her head violently, stumbling backward. "This isn't real. This isn't." "It spreads," he interrupted, his voice soft, patient, almost kind. "It always spreads." As if to prove it, he lifted one trembling hand from the soil. His nails were gone entirely, his fingertips dark and slick. When he brushed them across the porcelain edge of the tub, black streaks spread instantly, blooming outward like veins. The white surface cracked and split, roots writhing from within. Helen screamed. She turned and fled, the hallway tilting beneath her, the floor sagging as though it had softened into earth. She stumbled down the stairs, coughing, the smell clinging to her skin. Behind her, she heard the faint slither of movement, the wet scrape of something dragging itself closer. The front door loomed ahead. She hurled herself against it, wood splintering as she shoved it open. Rain lashed her face as she stumbled out into the orchard, the world spinning, her chest heaving. She did not look back. She could not. She ran until the house was gone, until her lungs burned and her vision blurred. She collapsed finally beneath a streetlight, its cold glow weak against the mist. She coughed until her throat tore, until black flecks stained her hand. When she finally staggered home, she stripped her clothes and scrubbed her skin raw beneath scalding water. But no matter how hard she scraped, she could still feel it, the grit beneath her nails, the damp smell in her hair, the soil pressing heavier in her lungs. That night she dreamed again. This time she stood in her classroom. The desks were empty, the air silent. She turned slowly, and Tobias sat at the back, watching her with his hollow eyes. His skin sloughed away piece by piece, falling soundlessly to the floor. Beneath it, worms writhed in black earth. Helen woke screaming, hair sheets drenched, hair nails dark. She knew, with a cold certainty that hollowed her chest, that she had not escaped at all. Helen told no one what she had seen in that rotting house. What words could she use? That a boy was peeling away into soil? That his skin broke like paper to reveal worms beneath? She had no proof. Nothing but the smell that clung to her lungs and the dirt she could not scrub from her nails. So she returned to school on Monday morning, pale and hollow-eyed, her throat raw from coughing. She forced her hands steady as she held chalk, though faint streaks of black marked the board where her fingers touched. The children noticed. Children always noticed. They leaned away when she passed down the aisles, their eyes wide, their whispers sharp. "She smells like him," one hissed to another. "She smells like the swamp." Helen swallowed her shame and pressed on, her voice hoarse. But by the third lesson, sweat slicked her brow, dampened her blouse. She felt the room press closer, heavy with the scent she now recognized not only around Tobias but within herself, the smell of earth, the smell of rot. Mark never returned. His desk sat empty, dust settling where his books once lay. The principal offered no explanation, only pursed lips and muttered assurances that the family is handling it. But the students filled the silence with their own tales. "He's gone underground," one boy whispered. "He's buried already," said another. "He turned into dirt." Their words turned the air sour. Helen snapped at them more often now. Her patience eroded, but her own cough betrayed her authority. Each fit shook her frame, spatters of dark grit speckling her handkerchief when she dared to look. She hid it quickly, but some of the children had seen. Their eyes widened, their chairs scraped back, and through it all, Tobias remained, or at least, for a time. One morning, his seat was empty. Helen called his name at roll, her voice trembling. No answer. No Tobias at the back desk. no smudge of soil beneath the chair. She asked the office, but the clerk frowned and shuffled through papers, shaking her head. "We don't have any student by that name," she said flatly. "Are you sure you marked the roster correctly?" Helen stared, stunned. "He's been in my class for weeks." The clerk only shrugged, already turning away. When Helen returned to her classroom, Tobias's desk was gone. Not empty, gone. As if it had been removed entirely, leaving only smooth floor where once there had been smears of black earth. The children said nothing. They would not even look at the corner where he had Saturday. Helen felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She heard his voice again, soft and patient in her mind. "It spreads." The days blurred. Helen stopped sleeping. When she closed her eyes, she felt worms shifting beneath her skin. She woke with streaks of dirt on her sheets, under her fingernails, smeared across her face, as though she had clawed herself in the night. She coughed until her ribs ached, until the taste of iron and soil coated her tongue. She avoided mirrors. In glimpses, she thought she saw her skin flaking, small curls peeling back to reveal something dark and damp beneath. She began wearing gloves to class, but the children still noticed. Their eyes followed her, wide and silent, shrinking from her, as if her very breath carried contagion. One girl whimpered softly whenever Helen passed. Another refused to touch her papers, pushing them back with trembling hands. The principal called her in again, his face drawn. "Helen, you're unwell. You need rest. A doctor." But Helen knew no doctor could treat this. No medicine could cure the smell rising from her own body, the heaviness in her chest. She left his office without replying, the echo of her cough following her down the hall. At home, her body betrayed her further. Sweat dripped constantly, dampening her sheets until her mattress grew dark with mold. Soil crusted at the corners of her eyes when she woke. Her hands left black streaks on every surface she touched. She tried to wash it away. She filled the bathtub and scrubbed until her skin burned. She poured bleach across her arms, choking on the fumes. But still the grit clung. Still the smell thickened. When she pulled the drain, water swirled dark, clogged with earth. Helen knelt there in the empty tub, shaking, whispering to herself, "Not me, not me, not me." But the words rang hollow. On Thursday night, a storm battered the town. Helen lay awake, coughing, her lungs rattling. She thought she heard voices beneath the thunder, faint whispers rising from the floorboards. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened. The sound was unmistakable. Soil shifting, worms writhing, roots creaking as they spread. She clutched her head and screamed, but the storm swallowed her voice. By Friday, she could not deny it any longer. Standing before her class, she felt her skin itch and burn. She pulled at her collar and saw it, the faint curl of peeling flesh at her throat, the glimmer of damp earth beneath. She tugged her sleeve down quickly, but the children had seen. Their cries filled the room, their desks screeching back as they fled. Helen sank into her chair, trembling. She could smell it stronger than ever now, pouring from her in waves, the air heavy and sour. She lowered her head onto her arms, her breath ragged. For a moment she thought she heard Tobias's voice again, whispering from just beyond her sight. "You see, it always spreads." That night she dreamed one final dream. She stood in the orchard, the dead trees looming around her, their branches black against the sky. Beneath her feet the ground pulsed, soft and damp. She looked down and saw her legs sinking, the soil swallowing her ankles, her knees. Tobias stood before her, pale and hollow-eyed, his skin already gone, his body a shifting mass of black earth and worms. He smiled faintly. "You're one of us now," he whispered. She screamed, but the soil rose higher, filling her mouth, her lungs, her eyes. She drowned in it, choking, thrashing, until at last she went still. Helen woke, gasping, clutching her throat. Her bed was damp, her sheets black with streaks of soil. She staggered to the bathroom, flicked on the light. In the mirror, her face stared back at her pale hollow, damp with sweat. She raised a trembling hand. Her reflection raised it too, but as her fingers brushed her cheek, flakes of skin crumbled away, revealing dark earth beneath. She dropped to her knees, sobbing, clawing at her own flesh. Grit fell in clumps onto the floor, writhing with pale worms. The smell was overwhelming. She closed her eyes. In the days that followed, Helen did not return to school. The children whispered about her the way they had about Tobias. Some said she had moved away. Others claimed she had been buried quietly, the ground at the cemetery bulging strangely above her grave. But those who lingered late in the halls swore they could still smell her. Damp, acrid, heavy, the smell of soil overturned, of roots pulling free. Sometimes, near her old classroom, they found faint black streaks across the floor. And sometimes late at night, they heard her cough, deep and wet, echoing through the walls. The dinner guest. The city never looked lonelier than it did after rain. Streetlights cast pale halos on the pavement, and every passing car left a ribbon of water trembling in its wake. Sarah's heels tapped softly against the stone as she walked beside Jack. The sound swallowed quickly by the hush of the hour. Jack made everything feel lighter. He had that sort of warmth about him, the kind that turned silence into comfort rather than awkwardness. He held her hand easily, thumb brushing over her knuckles as if they'd been together for years rather than months. For once, Sarah wanted to lean into the moment. For once, she wanted to pretend she wasn't who she was. But pretending had never come easy. All her life, Sarah's eyes had betrayed her. They saw what others couldn't, what others refused to. Shapes on stairwells, faces in windows, voices in reflections. She had learned to bury it, to walk fast, to keep her gaze forward. But the curse of second sight was that silence never stayed silent for long. Halfway down the empty block, a chill slid under her coat. Her step faltered. Jack glanced at her. "Cold?" "Little bit," she said, but the words came out thinner than she intended, because she knew the difference between a draft and a presence. She felt it now, the shift in air, the stillness that clung too tightly. She told herself not to turn around. Don't feed it. Don't let it grow. But curiosity was stronger than fear. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw her, a woman drifting several paces behind them, her figure too sharp to be shadow, too blurred to be real. Long black hair clung to her face as though wet, though the air was dry. Her eyes were dark, fixed not on Sarah but on Jack. Sarah's breath caught. The woman didn't walk. She floated, each movement soundless, her gaze unblinking. And when Jack squeezed Sarah's hand again, the figure seemed to lean closer, as if tethered to him. Sarah tore her eyes forward, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Jack was telling a story, something about a client at work, a misplaced set of keys, but his words barely reached her. Her ears were full of the cold, her chest tight with dread. Every few steps she looked back, and each time the woman was closer. At the corner, Sarah tugged Jack toward a lit cafe without explanation. "Let's stop in here," she said too quickly. Jack blinked. "Coffee this late? That's not usually your thing. Just a minute, please." Inside, the warmth felt like reprieve. A bell chimed overhead. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt sugar. Jack ordered tea and a pastry while Sarah sat rigid at the table, eyes flicking to every reflective surface. The darkened window, the polished teapot, the photo frames. She knew where to look. Spirits loved the edge of glass. Jack reached for her hand. "You're tense tonight. Everything okay?" Sarah forced a laugh. "Long day, that's all." But in the corner of the cafe window, her laughter froze. The woman's face pressed faintly against the glass from outside, eyes wide, lips curled into a smile too sharp to be kind. A fog of breath bloomed across the pane. Though the night beyond was clear, Sarah's hand tightened around Jack's without her meaning to. He looked at her, concerned. "Sarah?" She swallowed hard. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her thoughts betrayed her. "She's not here for me." When they stepped back out onto the street, the silence was heavier. Jack looked content, humming faintly as he walked, but Sarah felt the air closing in. She knew without looking that the presence followed still. Finally, at the next pool of lamplight, she dared to glance back. The woman was there, not drifting this time, but standing. Her dark eyes locked on Jack with the hunger of something that had waited too long. And Sarah understood with a bone-deep certainty. This spirit wasn't wandering, wasn't lost. She knew him. She wanted him. The air outside the cafe was sharp, almost metallic, and Sarah couldn't stop herself from glancing over her shoulder as she and Jack walked. The figure was there again, never more than a dozen steps behind, her long hair gleaming faintly under the street lamps. Her eyes locked on Jack as though Sarah didn't even exist. Sarah looped her arm tighter through his. She wanted to tell him, She wanted to stop him, to warn him that something old and hungry was tethered to his back. But how could she explain without sounding mad? How could she pull him into her vision, into the curse of seeing what should not be seen? Jack chuckled softly, brushing her arm. "You're clinging tonight. Not that I mind." Her laugh came brittle. "Just keeping you close." But the truth pressed heavier. She wasn't keeping him close. She was keeping something else out. Half a block later, Jack slowed. His head tilted, his brow furrowed. "You smell that?" Sarah blinked. "Smell what?" "Food. Something rich. Garlic. Wine. Like roast meat. Makes me hungry just walking past." He inhaled deeply, his smile spreading as though he'd discovered treasure. "God, I didn't realize how starving I was." Sarah's stomach tightened. The street was empty. The shops were shuttered, their windows dark. No restaurant spilled light or scent into the air. She opened her mouth to protest, but Jack had already turned, his gaze fixed down a narrow side street she had never noticed before. "There," he pointed, certain. "That place looks perfect." Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. At the end of the street stood a restaurant, its sign half faded, its windows glowing faintly with amber light. She was sure it hadn't been there before. The lettering on the awning was unfamiliar. Foreign, curling letters she couldn't quite read. The air pulsed with the scent Jack described, heavy and sweet. But beneath it, Sarah smelled something else. Mildew, damp wood, a faint tang of rot. Her breath hitched. "Jack," she began, but he was already striding toward it, drawn as if by a string. The restaurant was nearly empty inside, yet a table was set for two in the center, waiting. Candles flickered. A bottle of wine glowed darkly between the glasses. Jack laughed in delight. "See? Perfect. Like they knew we were coming." Sarah hesitated on the threshold. Her eyes flicked to the mirrored panel along the far wall. The glass was faintly tarnished, but enough to show shapes. In its surface, she saw Jack pulling out her chair with a smile. She saw herself hesitating, pale and tense. And behind Jack's reflection, she saw the woman. Her face hovered over his shoulder, hair dripping across his cheek, lips parted in a smile that showed too many teeth. Sarah's stomach lurched. She forced herself to sit, her every muscle rigid. Jack poured the wine, humming softly. "You're going to love this. I don't know how, but it feels familiar." Sarah clenched her fists in her lap. "You've never been here before." He looked up at her, genuinely surprised. "Of course I have. I used to come here all the time." Her heart froze. She had never heard him mention this place, and Jack wasn't the type to forget details. Yet his face glowed with certainty, as if the memory had been carved deep inside him. The waiter arrived, silent, faceless in Sarah's memory when she tried to focus. The food came steaming, rich, aromatic. Jack dug in eagerly, laughing, coaxing her to eat. But Sarah could barely lift her fork. Every reflective surface betrayed the truth. The wineglass shimmered with the woman's pale face. The cutlery caught glimpses of her fingers stroking Jack's arm, though nothing touched him in the real world. The mirror on the wall showed her more clearly than ever, seated just behind Jack, watching Sarah with eyes that gleamed like wet stone. Sarah leaned across the table, her voice low, urgent. "Jack, we need to go. Now." He laughed, shaking his head. "Relax, Sarah. You're so tense. This is just dinner." Her throat constricted. "It's not just dinner. Look around you. This place isn't." But the words faltered. Jack wasn't hearing her. He was humming again, almost under his breath, some tune she didn't know. And with each note, she saw the woman's smile widen in the mirror, her lips shaping the same song. Sarah pressed her nails into her palms until they broke skin. "Don't lose him," she thought desperately. "Don't let her take him." She glanced at the mirror again. The woman's lips moved, and for the first time, Sarah heard her voice, thin and cutting, carried through the clatter of dishes and the murmur of Jack's enjoyment. "He always loved this place," the voice whispered. "He's mine." Sarah's breath caught. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The shadows along the walls leaned closer. The restaurant seemed smaller, tighter, as if the room itself had been built to trap her. Jack raised his glass and smiled. "To us." Sarah tried to stop her hand from shaking as she touched her glass to his. But in the reflection of the clinking crystal, she saw the truth. Not two glasses meeting, but three. Her appetite collapsed. The smell of the food turned sour. like meat left to rot. She dropped her fork and grabbed Jack's wrist, forcing him to look at her. "We have to leave." He frowned, irritated for the first time. "What's gotten into you?" "It's just dinner." "Just..." His words faltered. For a moment his eyes lost their warmth, glazing dark, his smile twitching into something unfamiliar. Sarah's stomach twisted. For one heartbeat, he was not Jack at all. She yanked him to his feet. Chairs scraped across the floor. The waiter didn't protest, didn't move, just stood frozen as they stumbled toward the door. But before Sarah pushed it open, she dared one last look at the mirror. The woman's reflection sat calmly in her chair, smiling with triumph, raising a glass of wine as if to toast their departure. Outside, the cold night slapped Sarah's face. She clung to Jack's arm, dragging him down the street, her breath ragged. He let her, though confusion clouded his eyes. Finally, he said softly, "I don't understand you sometimes." Sarah bit her lip until she tasted blood. "You don't have to. Just trust me. Don't look back." But she knew the truth. The ghost hadn't finished. It wasn't retreating. It was waiting, biding, certain that Jack would return. Because whatever tethered him to that place was older than her warnings, older than her sight. And Jack, with a faint smile, whispered under his breath, "Feels like I left something behind." "Oh." The cold clung to Sarah even after they left the strange restaurant. She gripped Jack's arm so tightly that her nails pressed through his sleeve. But Jack seemed oddly unbothered, smiling faintly as if nothing unusual had happened. His warmth was steady, while hers drained away, replaced by dread. He didn't ask why she had dragged him out. He didn't protest. But he glanced back more than once, his eyes narrowing at the shuttered door, the faint glow within. Each time Sarah snapped her voice sharp. Don't look." He laughed softly. "Relax. It's just a place to eat." But Sarah knew better. She knew the way its reflection clung to her eyes, the way the woman's smile had spread in the glass. They walked for blocks, but the scent clung to them. Garlic, wine, roast meat. Sarah's stomach turned. She looked down at her shoes and saw wet prints spreading across the pavement, not hers, not Jack's. Prints too small, too sharp, appearing and vanishing in rhythm, with the soundless steps behind them. Sarah tried not to look back. She had learned years ago that attention gave strength, but Jack did not have her training. His gaze drifted, curious, tugged by something she could not control. Finally, he stopped short. "Wait," he said. His voice was low, uncertain, as if half asleep. "I know her." Sarah's blood iced. She turned slowly. "Who?" Jack's eyes were glassy, his lips parted in a faint smile. "The woman. The one who wanted us to go in there." Her hand tightened around his. "Jack, you don't know her." He shook his head, almost childlike. "No, I do." She looked familiar, like someone I used to. His voice trailed off. Sarah's throat locked. Back at her apartment, she tried to anchor him. She made tea. She turned on lights. She sat him down and held his hands between hers, searching his face. "Jack, listen to me. You have to stay with me, all right? Don't follow her. Don't listen." He smiled faintly, but it wasn't the smile she knew. It was thinner, sharper, too rehearsed. "You worry too much." Her breath hitched. "Please." He squeezed her hands once and leaned back. "I'm fine, really. I can't shake the feeling I left something behind." Sarah swallowed the rising panic. She couldn't tell him outright. He wasn't ready to hear it, but her heart screamed the truth. The thing he'd left behind was never his. It belonged to the ghost, and she had come to collect. That night, Sarah woke to the sound of a glass breaking in her kitchen. She rushed in, heart pounding. Jack was standing in front of the dark window, his reflection faint in the glass. He turned toward her slowly, his face pale, eyes distant. "I was hungry," he whispered. On the counter, the remains of a wine glass glistened on the tile. She looked at his hand. Blood welled from a cut on his palm. He didn't seem to feel it. Behind him, in the window's reflection, the woman stood. Her smile widened as she met Sarah's eyes. Sarah screamed. The next evening, against every desperate plea, Jack led her back to the restaurant. He claimed he was starving, that nothing at home tasted right, that only that place could satisfy him. Sarah tried to argue, begged him not to, but he only grew sharper, almost angry. something she had never seen in him before. When they stepped inside, the restaurant looked different, smaller, dimmer. The candles burned lower, their flames thin and sickly. A mirror stretched along one wall, larger than before, swallowing the room in its reflection. Jack sat eagerly, ordering food Sarah never touched. He laughed, joked, clinked his glass against hers, but Sarah's eyes were fixed on the mirror, because the mirror betrayed everything. It showed Jack eating, yes, but it also showed another figure seated across from him, where Sarah should have been. The woman. Her lips were red with wine, her smile cruel. Sarah's reflection was gone. Her throat closed. She staggered to her feet, the chair scraping. Jack looked up in confusion. "What's wrong?" She pointed at the mirror, her voice breaking. "Look, she's there. She's sitting with you." He frowned, followed her gaze. His face softened with something like recognition. "She looks familiar." Sarah's heart collapsed. She lunged to grab him, to drag him out. But before she could move, the woman in the mirror leaned forward, her black hair sliding across her face. She grinned at Sarah directly. Her voice slithered through the room, sharp and mocking. "He always loved this place." Sarah froze. The ghost's smile stretched wider, showing teeth like broken glass. "He's mine." Sarah staggered back, her chest heaving. The words sliced through her like knives, and then recognition struck her like lightning. The woman wasn't just some lost spirit, wasn't a stranger tethered to Jack. She knew her face now, younger, clearer, but unmistakable. Sarah had seen photos, tucked away in drawers Jack thought she never touched. It was Jack's wife. His wife who had died in an accident 3 years before. Her skin pale, her smile cruel, her love twisted into hunger. Jack's wife had come back for him. Sarah's vision blurred, her body trembling. Jack's eyes were glassy, his smile slow. He whispered, "She looks so beautiful tonight." Sarah's scream tore through the restaurant, but the sound felt swallowed, muffled, as though the room itself sided with the ghost. And in the mirror, the woman laughed. The mirror swallowed the room. Sarah stood trembling, her pulse hammering in her throat, as Jack's dead wife leaned forward in its surface, her lips curled into a smile that was more hunger than joy. The words still echoed in Sarah's head, cold and mocking. "He always loved this place. He's mine." Jack sat beside her at the table, glass of wine half raised, his eyes glazed. He looked between Sarah and the mirror as though struggling to decide which reality to believe. Sarah forced her voice through the choke in her throat. "Jack, don't listen. She isn't real." His brow furrowed, but then his lips curved faintly. "She looks familiar." Sarah gripped his arm so tightly her knuckles whitened. "That's not her. That's not the woman you loved. That's something else wearing her face." The ghost in the mirror laughed. The sound was thin, brittle, sharp enough to cut through glass. The restaurant had changed. The few candles on the tables sputtered, as if they were starving for air. The waiter was gone, the kitchen silent. Even the smell of food had curdled. Rich aromas turned sour, meat twisting into the reek of rot. Sarah looked around in desperation. Every surface reflected her enemy. Wineglasses caught the curve of a smile. The polished cutlery showed strands of black hair. The great mirror on the wall was alive with movement, the ghost's fingers caressing Jack's shoulder, though in the real world no one touched him. Jack blinked slowly, his voice faint. "I remember now. I brought her here once. We sat in this very spot." "No," Sarah snapped, panic burning her throat. "This place wasn't here. It's never been here. Don't you see? It's her trick." But Jack's expression softened with longing, his hand trembling as it reached toward the glass. The ghost leaned closer in the mirror, her hair spilling forward, her teeth glinting. "Come back to me," she whispered. Sarah shoved his hand down. "Jack, don't you dare." He turned to her then, and for the first time she saw something different in his eyes. Annoyance, sharp and unfamiliar. "Why are you fighting this? You don't understand." Sarah's stomach dropped. "That's not you talking." Jack's jaw clenched. For a moment his lips twisted into a smile that wasn't his, cruel and cold. He raised his glass and tilted it, red wine spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. In the mirror, the ghost raised her own glass at the same time, perfectly synchronized. Her eyes glinted with triumph. Sarah shot to her feet, the chair crashing behind her. "I won't let you have him," she shouted, her voice breaking. The mirror responded. The glass rippled like water, and the ghost stepped closer from within. Her laughter filled the room, a sound so sharp Sarah felt it slice into her bones. Jack rose too, but not by choice. His body jerked stiffly, as though pulled by unseen strings. His eyes darted toward the mirror, wide and fearful, but his mouth moved on its own. "She always knew how to make me happy," he whispered. Sarah's breath caught. That voice wasn't Jack's, not entirely. It was layered, a harmony of his tone with hers, the living and the dead woven into one. The ghost leaned close in the reflection, her lips brushing his ear, though in reality, only empty air separated them. "Yes, you remember now. Come back to me." Sarah lunged, grabbing both of Jack's arms, forcing him to face her. Tears blurred her vision. "Look at me, Jack. I'm real. She's gone. She's been gone for years." For a flicker of a second, she saw him, the man she knew, his eyes clearing, his lips parted. "Sarah," but then the mirror trembled violently, and the ghost's hand pressed against the inside of the glass. Cracks spidered outward, glinting white. The sound was like ice breaking. Sarah pulled Jack back, her voice hoarse. "Don't look at her. Look at me." The ghost slammed her palm again, harder. The crack deepened. She smiled wider, whispering, "Almost." Jack collapsed against Sarah, trembling. His body was heavy, like dead weight. She dragged him toward the door, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The restaurant seemed to stretch, the door receding as the walls closed in. The mirror expanded in her vision, filling everything. Wherever she looked, the ghost was there, her smile widening, her laughter rising to a shrill crescendo. Sarah screamed, forcing her legs to move, hauling Jack forward. "We're leaving." The glass finally shattered. The sound ripped through the room like thunder. Shards burst outward, scattering across the floor. But where they landed, they didn't reflect Sarah or Jack. They reflected only the ghost. Hundreds of fragments of her smile, her eyes, her hair. Sarah kicked through them, dragging Jack with her, refusing to look down. She slammed against the door. It groaned but held, as though nailed shut. She screamed again, the sound raw. Then, with a final heave, it burst open. They stumbled into the night. The air was freezing, rain stinging her skin, but Sarah didn't care. She dragged Jack down the street, her breath ragged. He stumbled, half-conscious, muttering incoherently. When she dared glance back, the restaurant was dark again. Its windows were boarded, its awning sagging. No glow, no waiter, no table set for two. But she knew better. She knew it would be there again, waiting. Jack groaned against her shoulder. I need to go back." Sarah shook him hard. "No, don't say that. Don't even think it." He met her eyes then, and for a moment his expression softened. But his lips twitched, almost into a smile she didn't recognize. Her chest went cold. That night, Sarah sat awake beside him in her apartment, watching his every breath, afraid to blink. His skin was pale, his dreams restless. Once, he murmured a name she didn't know. Once, his hand lifted as though reaching toward something only he could see. Sarah whispered to herself over and over, "You're not hers. You're mine. You're not hers. You're mine." But when she finally drifted into exhausted sleep, she dreamed of the mirror. She saw the ghost seated calmly at their table, pouring herself another glass of wine, smiling as if the night belonged to her. And from the far end of the reflection, Jack raised his own glass to meet hers. Sarah thought the night air would save them. When she dragged Jack through the rain-slick streets, his body heavy against her shoulder, she told herself that every step carried them further from the ghost's grasp. The city would wake soon. Dawn would chase away shadows. Reality would reclaim him, but dawn came pale and indifferent, and Jack did not return to himself. He sat at her kitchen table that morning, untouched toast on a plate before him. His eyes drifted, unfocused, as though replaying memories she couldn't reach. Sometimes he smiled faintly at nothing. Sometimes he whispered words too soft to catch. Sarah hovered at the counter, her own hands trembling. "Jack, talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." He blinked slowly, looked at her, and smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was stretched thinner, sharper, an echo of the one she'd seen in the mirror. "I feel like I should go back. he said simply. Her breath caught. No, no, you don't. I left something there, he murmured. Something important. I can't remember what, but I know it's waiting. Sarah's vision blurred. She slammed her palms against the counter. That wasn't you in there. It wasn't real. She's dead, Jack. She's gone. He frowned, puzzled, as if she'd told him the sky was green. I know she's gone. His voice softened into a whisper, but she didn't feel gone. That night, Sarah refused to sleep. She watched Jack toss and turn, his lips parting as though answering some voice in his dreams. At one point, he sat up, staring into the darkness, whispering, "Pour me another." Esquine clicked. She turned on every light. She taped paper over the mirrors. She clutched his hands until her knuckles burned, but still the air around them cooled, and still she felt the invisible weight of eyes watching. By the third day, Sarah knew she was losing. Jack grew restless. He left plates of food untouched, then complained of hunger. He stood at the window too long, staring at nothing. His reflection in the glass sometimes moved just a little too slowly, his smile curving before his lips did, and then came the moment she dreaded. They walked past a row of shuttered shops. Sarah held his hand like an anchor, but Jack stopped short, his breath catching. "There it is," he whispered. Sarah followed his gaze. The restaurant stood at the corner, lights glowing softly, a table visible through the glass. 2 glasses of wine gleamed red. A chair was pulled out, waiting. Sarah shook her head violently. "No, it's not real." Jack's lips curved. "It feels real." She dragged him past, her heart hammering, but his eyes clung to it long after the corner turned. That evening, Sarah sat him down and told him everything. She told him about her sight, about the curse of seeing what others couldn't. She told him about the woman she saw on the street that first night, hovering, watching him. She told him how the ghost had laughed in the mirror, how she had whispered, "He's mine." Jack listened quietly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. When she finished, her chest heaving, he tilted his head and smiled faintly. "You saw her too?" Sarah blinked. "Yes, I saw her." His smile deepened. "Then it wasn't just me." The bottom dropped out of her stomach. On the 5th night, Sarah woke alone in bed. She stumbled through the apartment, calling his name. Her throat tightened when she saw the front door ajar. The streets were nearly silent, mist clinging to the pavement. She ran barefoot, heart cracking open with every step. And there, at the end of the block, she saw him. Jack stood before the restaurant, its windows glowing. Inside, the ghost waited, seated at their table. She raised a glass to him, her smile wide and cruel. "Jack." Sarah screamed, voice breaking. He turned slightly. For a heartbeat, his eyes were his own, soft and full of sorrow. But then, the glow of the restaurant washed over him, and his face smoothed into calm. "I forgot something," he said gently, and he stepped inside. Sarah chased him. The door slammed before she reached it. She pounded until her fists bled, until her voice was hoarse. But the glass only showed her own reflection, pale and desperate, no light within. At last she sank to her knees, sobbing. When she looked up again, the restaurant was gone. The corner was empty. Only boarded shops and dark windows remained. Jack was gone too. Weeks passed. Sarah stopped sleeping. She wandered the streets at night, hoping to find the glow again, praying and dreading in equal measure. Sometimes she thought she caught the scent of garlic and wine. Sometimes she heard faint laughter and the clink of glass. Once, she swore she saw him through a fogged window, Jack seated at a table, smiling, raising a glass to the woman beside him. But when she blinked, the window reflected only herself. Months later, Sarah tried to move on. She returned to her routines, her job, her quiet apartment, but mirrors betrayed her. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the corner of her vision, a shadow not her own. Then it grew clearer, in the glass of the bathroom mirror, in the gleam of her phone screen, in the reflection of a cafe window. She saw it, the restaurant, faint and far away, a table set for 2. And sometimes, she saw Jack there, his face content, his hand brushing against the woman's. The ghost always looked up and smiled at Sarah. One evening, unable to resist, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine. She sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her breath caught, for in the reflection she wasn't alone. The restaurant shimmered faintly behind her. The ghost sat across the table, glass raised, eyes glinting with triumph. And beside her, Jack lifted his own glass, his smile soft and distant. Sarah's hand shook. She whispered, "Jack." In the reflection, his lips moved, but she couldn't hear the words. The ghost heard her, though. The ghost leaned closer, her grin slicing wide. "We saved you a seat," she whispered. Sarah's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. She closed her eyes, but when she opened them again, the window showed only her pale face, alone in the dark. For now, the confession tape, the ceiling fan hummed with a tired rhythm, slicing the silence into restless fragments. Detective Mark Rivers sat at his desk long after midnight, the blinds drawn, the city outside wrapped in wet neon. His office smelled of stale coffee and rainwater tracked in on his boots. He had turned the lights low, as if he could keep his thoughts hidden in the shadows. The box sat in front of him, small, unmarked, its cardboard soft at the edges from damp. It had been left at the front desk with his name written in black ink. No return address, no explanation. Inside was a cassette tape, old, worn, its label torn away so clean it looked deliberate. Mark stared at it as if the thing might blink. He didn't like tapes. Too permanent, too naked. A tape didn't edit itself, didn't forget what was said. A tape was a memory that refused to rot. And lately, memory was not his friend. His chest tightened. He lit another cigarette and told himself to wait until morning. But his hand betrayed him, sliding the cassette into the deck on his desk. The machine gave a soft click, a whir, the low hiss of static waiting to be shaped into words. He pressed play. At first, there was only silence, broken by the faint grind of the spools. Then a voice crawled out from the static, distorted, low, blurred with some kind of filter. "Do you want to know how it feels?" Mark froze. The voice was not a stranger's, not familiar either. It was a shape without a face, stretched and broken by tape hiss, but thick with something that made his skin prickle. Intimacy. The voice continued, slow, savoring. "The first cut is never deep enough. You think it will be. You think skin gives way like paper. But no, it fights. You have to press harder. You have to feel the blade work for you. And then it opens." Mark's stomach clenched. He exhaled smoke through trembling lips. The voice laughed softly, muffled by distortion. "They call me the Carver. I never chose the name, but maybe it fits." Mark's throat was dry. His mind flitted to the crime scene photos, the cold cases pinned on corkboards across the precinct. The Carver was real, a shadow in the city for nearly a decade, carving his victims with cruel patience, never caught. But this was no ordinary confession, because every word, every detail, every note of satisfaction in the killer's tone struck a chord Mark recognized, not from case files, from memory. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the desk, breath sharp. The voice pressed on, describing the sound of blood dripping onto tile, the way the victim's breath hitched before it broke into silence. Mark's hands shook. He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray, leaving a smear of ash. His pulse hammered against his ribs, because the details matched. Not just any killing, not any Carver case. It matched Alex. Alex, his friend. His only friend, if he was honest. Alex, lying on the floor of Mark's apartment 3 nights ago, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing soundlessly as Mark pressed the blade in. Mark swallowed hard, bile rising. His own voice whispered in his head, cruel and undeniable. "You did that. You killed him." He staggered to his feet, pacing the small room, one hand clutching his hair. The tape droned on. "You hold them down, even when they fight. You smell the sweat, the fear. You tell yourself you'll stop. You never stop." Mark pressed his palms to his ears, but the words seemed to leak through bone. Alex's face rose in memory. The night replayed itself whether he wanted it or not. The argument, the jealousy boiling over, the flash of the knife. The sound Alex made when the steel slid into him, shocked, betrayed, final. Mark had told himself it was the sickness talking, the paranoia, the anger that clouded reason. But hearing it now, played back to him in a stranger's warped voice, felt like judgment. He stopped pacing and stared at the deck, the reels turning steady, the hiss filling every inch of the room. This isn't just a story. The carver whispered. "This is proof. I'm still here, and you can't hide from what you've done." Mark stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving out. His heart raced until it drowned the fan's drone, until it eclipsed the rain against the window. He whispered into the dark, voice breaking. "Alex?" The tape clicked, as if in answer. Mark staggered back to the desk, slammed the stop button, yanked the tape free. He held it in both hands, staring at the little reels, the magnetic ribbon inside. His skin crawled. His mind spiraled. Was this some cruel trick? Had someone been in the room that night? Had Alex left this behind, knowing Mark's paranoia would eat him alive? Or was this something worse? His reflection in the window across the room caught his eye. For one dizzying second, he thought he saw Alex standing there, faint and pale, a smear of blood at his collar, smiling faintly. Mark dropped the tape. It rattled against the floor, spinning once before lying still, hissing faintly from where the spools still turned inside. He could not breathe. Mark sank into his chair, trembling. He pressed his face into his hands, trying to steady his thoughts. But the tape still whispered in his head, distorted and patient. "You have to press harder. You have to feel the blade work for you." He looked up, and the tape was on the desk again. Not on the floor where it had fallen. On the desk, waiting. Mark couldn't take his eyes off the cassette. It sat on the desk as if it had never moved. Its reel stilled now, silent. But his heart still pounded in his ears as though the distorted voice were still droning through the hiss. His cigarette had burned down to the filter in the ashtray. The smell of it was sharp, bitter. He lit another with trembling hands, but the flame jumped too high, making him flinch. He cursed under his breath. For a moment, he thought of picking up the tape and burning it, ending it, but the thought sickened him even more. He couldn't. He needed it. It wasn't just his memory anymore. It wasn't just his crime. Now there was proof. Mark snatched up the phone, his voice breaking as he punched in the number. "Central," came the weary dispatcher's tone. "This is Detective Rivers," Mark rasped. I need units at my place. Now, evidence. I've got evidence." "Calm down, detective." "What kind of evidence?" Mark looked at the tape, sweat dripping down his temple. "A confession. A recording. It's him. It's the carver. He left it for me. He's admitting to it all." There was a pause. He thought he heard typing, muffled voices in the background. Then, "Sit tight, detective. We'll send someone over." The line went dead. Mark set the receiver down slowly, staring at his shaking hand. The carver. It made sense, didn't it? If the bastard wanted to toy with him, why not drop the tape here? Mark had been chasing him for years. After all, maybe this was just another of the carver's games. Except, Mark's gaze drifted toward the shadowed corner of the room. He swore he saw a figure there, hunched, head cocked, watching him. His breath caught. "Alex," he whispered, but when he blinked, the corner was empty. He rubbed his eyes hard, cursed again, and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. The glass clinked against his teeth as he drank too fast, the burn searing down his throat. The tape sat waiting. He told himself not to touch it again. He told himself to wait for the uniforms to arrive, to hand it over, to wash his hands of it. But the silence pressed in, thick and unbearable. The hiss of the tape still lived in his ears. He shoved the cassette back into the deck and pressed play. The voice returned at once, almost eager. "You can't stop once you've started. You think one life will be enough. But it never is. It gnaws at you. You remember the way they looked at you, the shock, the betrayal. You remember the way their mouth tried to form your name." Mark's breath caught. "Alex." He heard it again, so clear now. Alex, staring up at him from the floor, lips working soundlessly around his name. The voice pressed on. "You tell yourself it was anger, a mistake. But in truth, it was joy. You wanted it. You needed it." Mark slammed the stop button with a shout, his chair skidding back. He stumbled to his feet, knocking his whiskey glass to the floor. The crash echoed in the silence. From the window, thunder rolled. Rain began to lash the glass. Mark swore he saw a shape on the other side. Alex, pale, dripping, smiling faintly as he raised a hand in mock greeting. Mark staggered back, his chest heaving. "No," he whispered. "You're gone. You're not here." But the rain streaked the glass, and behind it, For one long heartbeat, Alex's face lingered. Then it was gone. The storm howled louder. Mark paced the room like a caged animal, dragging his fingers through his hair. "It's the carver," he muttered to himself. "It has to be. He knew the details, that's all. He's mocking me. That's all." He looked at the tape again, but the voice in his head whispered otherwise. "That was you. That was always you." Time blurred. Mark lit and crushed out one cigarette after another, the ashtray filling fast. His hands shook too badly to pour another drink. Every creak of the building made him flinch. Every shadow looked like Alex standing just out of reach. Once, he thought he heard footsteps in the hall outside his apartment. He rushed to the door, yanked it open. Nothing but the dim flicker of the hallway bulb, the carpet damp with tracked-in rain. Still, he swore he heard laughter as he closed the door again. Finally, red and blue lights flared across the blinds. Tires hissed on the wet street below. Relief crashed over him. He yanked the door open as two uniformed officers stepped up the stairwell. "Detective Rivers?" one asked. "Yes," Mark rasped. His voice sounded alien in his own ears. He held up the cassette in its case, his hand trembling. "Evidence. The carver," he confessed. "It's all here." The officers exchanged a look. One of them radioed in quietly. "Sit tight, detective," the taller one said, his tone calm but wary. "We'll need to hear it." Mark nodded frantically. Yes, of course. Come in." He led them into the dim apartment, gesturing to the tape deck. He shoved the cassette inside, pressed play with shaking fingers. The hiss filled the air. Mark's throat closed as the distorted voice slithered back into the room. "The first cut is never deep enough. You think skin gives way like paper. But no." Mark's hands clenched into fists. His heart raced as the words replayed exactly as before. The description, the laughter, the dripping silence. He turned to the officers, desperate, wide-eyed. "You hear it? You hear him, don't you?" The taller officer frowned, leaning closer to the machine. The other officer's face was blank. When the voice finished speaking, the taller one straightened. "Detective," he said slowly, "what exactly are we supposed to be hearing?" Mark blinked. The officer's voice was calm. "This tape is blank." The hiss faded. Mark's world tilted, a sick vertigo flooding his skull. He looked at the machine, at the spinning reels. He could still hear the voice, could still feel it wrapping around his chest. But the officer stood there in silence, watching him carefully. And from the corner of his eye behind one officer's shoulder, Mark saw Alex, standing, smiling, pointing at the tape. Mark's knees buckled. He staggered forward, gasping. No, you don't understand. It's real. It's real." The officers exchanged a look. One moved toward him, reaching for his arm. Mark backed away, clutching the tape to his chest. His vision swam, Alex's pale face still lingering just beyond reach. "It's him," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "It's the carver. It's him," he confessed, but Alex only smiled wider, his finger still aimed at the tape deck. The squad room buzzed with fluorescent light and the low mutter of radios. Mark sat at a table in the small interview room, his jacket damp from rain, his nerves frayed to the wire. The cassette lay in front of him, innocent and mute. His cigarette burned down between his fingers, ash dropping unnoticed onto the linoleum. He stared at the tape as though it might leap from the table and confess for him. The door clicked. Two officers entered Sergeant Hall, tall and broad with tired eyes, and a younger uniform, Alvarez, notebook in hand. Hall dropped into the chair opposite Mark, folding his hands. "Detective Rivers, you want to tell me what this is about?" Mark gestured at the tape, his voice raw. "Play it. You'll hear it. He calls himself the carver. He describes everything. The knife, the sound, the blood. You'll hear it." Hall glanced at Alvarez, who shrugged. Then Hall slid the cassette into a portable player, pressed play. The hiss filled the room. Seconde passed. Nothing. Only the faint scrape of tape rolling, static soft as breath. Mark's hands tightened into fists. No, it was there. I heard it. Every word." Hall's brow furrowed. "All due respect, detective. This is blank." Mark's pulse hammered. He leaned forward, desperate. "You're not listening hard enough. Wait for it." They let it roll. The hiss stretched, endless, suffocating. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between their blank faces, and then he heard it. The voice, slithering up from beneath the static. Warped, patient, you hold them down, even when they beg. You remember their eyes. You remember the name they tried to say. Mark lurched forward, pointing. There. Right there, you hear that? But Hall only shook his head slowly. Alvarez scribbled something down, his pen scratching too loud. Mark slammed his fist on the table. You didn't hear that? He said it. He said it. Hall's voice was steady, careful. Detective, there's nothing on this tape. Mark's throat closed. He looked to the corner of the room, the one patch of glass that reflected them back a small observation mirror. For a moment, he saw 3 men at the table, not 4. Himself, Hall, Alvarez, and Alex, standing behind Hall, his reflection pale and grinning, blood trickling at the corner of his mouth. Mark's breath hitched. He tore his eyes away, pressing his hands to his skull. He's here, he whispered. You don't see him, but he's here. Hale's voice sharpened. Detective Rivers, focus. You've been under stress. You lost a friend recently, didn't you? Alex Monroe? The name punched the air from Mark's lungs. He looked up slowly, eyes wild. You leave him out of this. Hall exchanged a glance with Alvarez. Then softly, we found him, detective. In your apartment. Knife wounds. You want to explain that? Mark's vision swam. No, you don't understand. That's why I have the tape. It's not me. It's him. It's the carver. The tape clicked off. Mark sagged in his chair, trembling. His cigarette had burned to the filter, ash singeing his fingers. He flinched, hissed, dropped it. Hall pushed the ashtray closer. You need to rest, Rivers. You're not making sense. But Mark wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the dark cassette. He could still hear the voice, even in silence. Louder now, clearer, almost intimate. You wanted it. You pressed the blade yourself. You liked the way he looked at you when he knew. Mark's stomach turned. He shook his head violently. No, that's not me. Hall's voice broke through, sharp. What's not you? Mark realized he'd spoken aloud. He clamped his mouth shut. Alvarez leaned in, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Detective, nobody's accusing you yet, but you're not helping yourself. Mark's laugh came out jagged. Not accusing me? You already have. He shoved back from the table, pacing the room, running both hands through his hair. His reflection in the observation glass followed, except it didn't. In the reflection, Alex stood behind him, smiling faintly, pointing at the tape deck again. Mark spun, slamming his palm against the mirror. Stop it. Get out of here. Hall shot to his feet. Rivers, sit down. Mark's chest heaved. His eyes burned. Don't you see him? He screamed. Hall's jaw clenched. He stepped carefully closer. You need to calm down before this gets worse. But Mark couldn't calm down. The voice was everywhere now, in the hiss of the tape, in the hum of the lights, in the whisper of rain against the window. Alex's voice. He remembered the night again. Unbidden. Alex shouting. His face twisted in betrayal. The blade in Mark's hand. The jealousy burning his veins. The sound when it ended wet. Final. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, but the memory only grew sharper. Detective Rivers. Hall's voice was firmer now. Where were you the night Alex Monroe died? Mark's laugh was broken, hysterical. You tell me. Apparently I've got it on tape. He slammed the cassette into the deck again. Hit play. The hiss filled the air, and the voice rose, clearer than ever. You did it, Mark. Mark froze. That wasn't the carver's distortion anymore. That was Alex's voice. Pure. Clear. You killed me. Mark reeled back from the table, stumbling. Hall barked something. Alvarez rose, but Mark barely heard them. His ears rang with Alex's voice. His eyes glued to the cassette as the reels turned. You killed me, and now you want them to believe it was someone else. But it was your hands, your knife, your rage. Tears stung Mark's eyes. Stop. Please. Stop. But the voice pressed on, soft and relentless. You can't bury me, Mark. You can't tape over me. I'll play back forever. Mark fell to his knees, clutching his head, sobbing. Hall loomed over him, shouting orders. Alvarez was already at the door, calling for backup, but Mark didn't hear them, because when he looked up through the blur of tears, Alex was there. Not a reflection, not a trick of shadow, standing in the corner of the room, smiling, pointing at him now, The fluorescent light hummed above him, too bright, too steady. Mark sat hunched at the interrogation table, sweat dampening his shirt. His hands twitched restlessly in his lap. The tape lay there, still warm from its last spin. Sergeant Hall leaned forward, his arms folded. "Detective Rivers, we need clarity. You called us down here, said you had a confession from the carver. We hear nothing, not a word. But you hear something, don't you?" Mark swallowed, his throat raw. "Yes, he's on there. He describes everything, every cut, every sound. It's the carver. You have to believe me." Hall studied him, long and steady. "Or maybe it's you, detective. Maybe you're not listening to a killer. Maybe you're listening to yourself." Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. No, but doubt slithered cold through his skull. He shoved the tape back into the deck, pressing play with shaking fingers. The hiss rose, filling the room, and then the voice began again. At first distorted, familiar, but as the words spilled out, the filter fell away. The cadence sharpened, the tone steadied. It wasn't the carver. It wasn't Alex. It was him, Mark's own voice, describing every movement, every drop of blood, every sob of the dying man. He clutched the edges of the table, his knuckles whitening. "No, that's not me. That's not..." Hall's face hardened. "It sounds like you." Mark shook his head wildly. No. The voice from the tape pressed on, merciless. "You wanted him gone. You couldn't stand the way he laughed, the way he made you small. You wanted to cut him down until he belonged only to you." Mark's lungs locked. He gasped like a drowning man. Across the table, Alvarez wrote furiously, the pen scratching like a blade. Hall's tone was calm, measured. "Detective Rivers, are you ready to explain? Because this tape, this isn't evidence against the carver. This is evidence against you." Mark leapt to his feet, the chair skidding. "No, you don't get it. I didn't record that. I didn't..." The voice from the tape overlapped his protest, speaking in perfect unison with his lips. "I did it. I pressed the knife in. I watched him die." Mark's throat seized. He snapped his head toward the corner, and Alex was there. Not pale, not fleeting, whole. His skin gleamed with a faint sheen of sweat, his shirt still damp with the stain at his chest. He stood with easy calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Alex smiled, raised one finger, pointed at Mark. Hall and Alvarez turned sharply, following his gaze, but their eyes only landed on the blank wall. "Who are you looking at?" Alvarez asked cautiously. Mark's knees buckled, his voice cracked. "You don't see him? He's right there." The tape spun on. The voice grew louder, clearer. "I killed Alex Monroe, my friend, my only friend. I killed him because I couldn't stand the thought of losing him to anyone else. I killed him because I loved him too much to let him leave me." Mark screamed, lunging at the deck, slamming the stop button. But the voice didn't stop. It rolled out of the air itself, filling every corner of the room. Hall was on his feet, hand raised for calm. "Detective Rivers, you need to control yourself." Mark pounded his fists on the table. "It's lying. I didn't..." But even as he shouted, his memory betrayed him. The knife, the sweat, the moment Alex's eyes widened, his mouth opening around Mark's name, the sound of his last breath. The truth replayed, as merciless as the tape. Tears burned Mark's eyes. He stumbled back, pressing himself into the wall. Alex moved closer now, one slow step at a time. The smile never faded. "You can't bury me," Alex said softly, his voice layered with the hiss of the tape. "You can't tape over me. I'll play back forever." Mark's sob ripped from his chest. "Stop, please stop." Hall's voice thundered over him. "Detective Rivers, did you kill Alex Monroe?" Mark shook his head violently, but the words spilled out anyway, torn from somewhere deeper than will. "Yes," he screamed, his voice shattered. "Yes, I killed him." The room froze. Hall's jaw tightened. Alvarez's pen slipped from his fingers. Mark collapsed to his knees, his breath breaking into sobs. His hands clutched at his hair, his face pressed to the cold tile. The tape clicked off. Silence roared in its wake. Alex was gone. Only Mark remained, trembling, broken, his confession echoing in the empty air. The door opened. More officers poured in. Metal glinted. Mark felt his wrists wrenched behind him. steel cuffs biting into his skin. The words of his confession still seemed to hang in the room, replaying themselves with every hiss of his breath. Hall's voice was flat. "Detective Mark Rivers, you're under arrest for the murder of Alex Monroe." Mark raised his head once, eyes red, searching the corner. For a flicker, he saw Alex again, smiling faintly. Then the image dissolved into shadow. The cell was small, square, and too bright. Mark sat on the cot with his head bowed, wrists cuffed in front of him. The fluorescent light hummed overhead like a wasp that would never land. 3 days had passed, or maybe only one. Time in the precinct holding block had a way of collapsing in on itself. Cigarettes weren't allowed here. Coffee was bitter sludge. The only thing Mark had to look at was the tape, sealed in an evidence bag on the desk outside his bars. He could still hear it, even through plastic, even through silence. "You did it, Mark. You killed me." He pressed his palms against his ears, but the words seeped through bone. The detectives came and went. They asked their questions. They replayed the tape in the evidence lab. Every time, they came back with the same words. "There's nothing on it. Nothing." But when they left Mark alone, when the cell block hushed into its restless sleep, the sound would creep back to life. Hiss, then words, then Alex's voice, soft, steady, unforgiving. "You tried to hide me, but I'll play forever." Mark whispered back, his voice raw. "I didn't want to. I didn't mean to. You made me." But even he didn't believe it anymore. On the 4th night, the DA herself came down. She was sharp in her suit, her heels echoing on the concrete. She carried a folder under one arm. She looked at him the way someone looks at a broken mirror, reluctant, disappointed, but unable to ignore. "Detective Rivers," she said, sliding the folder onto the desk. "We've reviewed your statement. We've reviewed the scene. The blood, the fingerprints, the knife." She tapped the folder. "It all points one way." And Mark lifted his head, his eyes hollow. "It wasn't me. It was the carver. It was always him." The DA tilted her head. "Funny thing, the carver hasn't been active in months. Not since the night Alex Monroe died." Mark's stomach turned. She leaned in. "Maybe there never was a carver. Maybe it was you all along." After she left, silence returned. But Mark wasn't alone. He felt Alex before he saw him. The drop in temperature, the pressure in his chest, the faint scent of cigarette smoke that wasn't there. Then he was there, sitting on the cot beside him, blood still soaking his shirt, smile faint and cruel. Mark curled against the wall, shaking. "You're not real." Alex chuckled softly. "Neither is your innocence." Mark pressed his palms against his eyes, rocking. "Stop. Please stop." But Alex only leaned closer. "Confessions don't disappear, Mark. You recorded me once, and now I've recorded you." The next morning, Hall came to escort him to arraignment. He looked older, wearier, as if the case had hollowed him out too. He paused outside the bars. "You know what I don't get?" Hall muttered. "That tape. We dusted it. You were the only one who touched it, but it was found on Alex Monroe's desk." Mark's head snapped up. Hall frowned. "We checked. His landlord swears it was on his desk the night he died. Label torn off. Just sitting there." Mark's throat closed. No, that's not possible." Hall gave a humorless chuckle. "You tell me." He opened the cell. "Let's go." The courtroom was sterile, the air stale with paper and whispers. Mark stood shackled, the eyes of strangers on him. The tape was played again, projected for the record. Silence. Only hiss. The judge frowned, impatient. The jury shifted, confused. To them, it was blank. To Mark, it screamed. His own voice, clear and merciless. "I killed him. I killed Alex Monroe." Mark broke down on the stand. He sobbed, begged, clawed at his hair, confessing over and over. The jury didn't need the tape. They had his words. They had his collapse. The verdict was swift. In prison, nights were long. The tape never left him. Sometimes he swore he could hear it spinning beneath his bunk. Sometimes it echoed in the pipes, the hiss of running water, the static of the intercom. And sometimes, when he dared glance at the steel mirror bolted to the wall, Alex stood behind him, always smiling, always pointing at him. Months later, a guard found Mark slumped in his cell, his body twisted, his face frozen mid-scream. The tape lay beside him, reels still turning, though no machine held it. They sealed it back into evidence, filed it away. But late at night, in the records room, clerks swore they could hear a hiss, and if they listened too long, they swore they heard a voice. "You can't tape over me. I'll play forever." The taxidermist's eyes. The wind moved strangely in that town. Not fierce, not sharp, just steady, as though it was always drifting down the same narrow streets, brushing the same shingles, rattling the same loose shutters for years uncounted. When Eliza first arrived, she thought the sound comforting. Small towns often held their own kind of quiet music. Bells from the church tower, crickets fading into dusk, the hum of an old sewing machine that some neighbor seemed to run long after dark. It was the kind of place people forgot. Which, for Eliza, was perfect. She had come with little more than a suitcase and a second-hand car. A woman in her 30s with no family left to speak of. She found herself chasing solitude as though it were the only thing that might still keep her safe. Cities had too many eyes. Towns like this had fewer, or so she thought. Her new cottage was narrow, its garden overgrown, but it looked out across the square, and across that square stood the man the town seemed to orbit in silence. Mr. Silas. She saw him first on the day she moved in. While she struggled with a box too heavy for her arms, he appeared at the edge of her yard, tall, lean, wearing a black vest and trousers that looked pressed even in the afternoon Sunday. His shoes were polished, his tie perfectly knotted. But more than the clothes, it was his stillness that struck her. He moved like someone who had practiced each gesture, set each limb where it belonged, then left it there. "Miss Eliza," he said smoothly, though she had never offered her name. "Welcome." She blinked. "Oh, thank you. You must be my neighbor?" His lips curved not quite a smile, more like a demonstration of one. "Silas, I live just there." He gestured toward the tall brick house at the far corner. Its shutters were closed, even in daylight. Eliza managed a polite nod, though her heart tugged with unease. There was something about his face. His skin looked too smooth for his age, as if no crease had ever been allowed to linger. His eyes, pale, luminous, caught the light strangely, almost reflecting it back at her. Still, she forced a smile. "It's nice to meet you." He inclined his head, the gesture exact, rehearsed. It is always good to have new life in town. Over the next week, she noticed him often. Too often. In the mornings, she would pass him in the square, standing outside the butcher's, though she never saw him purchase anything. In the afternoons, he strolled along the hedges, his pace slow, his posture perfectly upright. And at night, she sometimes caught the faint glow of lamplight through the windows of his workshop at the back of the brick house. The shapes moved strangely inside. Shadows stretched long and stiff, like antlers or wings. A neighbor explained in hushed tones, "He's a taxidermist. Been one for decades. Folks say he's the best there is. Animals look alive in his hands, sometimes too alive." Eliza nodded, though her stomach shifted uneasily. Her first real conversation with him came on a Sunday. She returned from the market with a basket of bread, cheese, and apples. To her surprise, Silas was waiting at her gate, dressed as meticulously as ever, his hands clasped before him. "Miss Eliza," he said, "have you found the town to your liking?" She laughed lightly, though her nerves stirred. "It's quieter than I expected, which is good." He tilted his head, studying her as though cataloging her response. Quiet can be a form of perfection. She hesitated, then lifted her basket. "Would you like to come in for something to eat? It's only bread and cheese," but his eyes flickered. For a moment, she swore the faintest shadow passed over them, like a glint of glass catching Sunday. But then he inclined his head. "That would be pleasant." Inside, she set the table awkwardly, trying to fill the silence with chatter. He listened with perfect politeness, his hands folded on his lap, his posture unbroken. She pushed the plate of bread toward him. "Please." He looked at it as though at an object in a museum. Then, slowly, he raised a slice to his lips. He set it down again, untouched. "You don't eat?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned his head toward her, his expression utterly still. "Not often." The words unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She busied herself with her own plate, trying to keep her eyes from drifting back to him. But when she did, she caught it just for a heartbeat. At his wrist, beneath the edge of his immaculate cuff, Something dark traced across the skin. A line, uneven, like a stitch. Her hand froze on the bread knife, but when she blinked, the cuff had slipped back into place, hiding whatever she thought she saw. Silas's luminous eyes met hers across the table. "Do you sew, Miss Eliza?" he asked calmly. Her throat tightened. "No, not really." He nodded once, as though satisfied, then rose, perfectly measured. "Thank you for the company." And before she could think of what to say, he was gone, leaving only the faint impression of polish and the silence of a room where no food had been touched. That night, Eliza lay awake in her narrow bed, the wind moving steady outside, the church bell tolling the hour. She told herself it was nothing, just a man with odd manners, a neighbor with old habits, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again, that faint line at his wrist, dark and crooked, like a seam where flesh had been stitched together. And she could not shake the feeling that those luminous eyes of his had been watching not just her face, but deeper, as though measuring her for something she could not yet name. In the mornings, Eliza walked through the square on her way to the grocer's, and in the mornings, without fail, she saw Mr. Silas. He was never hurried, always in the same black vest, the same polished shoes. He would stand outside his brick house, sometimes dusting the steps though there was no dust, sometimes adjusting the shutters though they had not moved. He would nod to her when she passed, his expression perfectly composed, his luminous eyes catching the sun like 2 drops of water. It should have been reassuring, familiar even, but each time she met that gaze, she felt measured, as though he wasn't seeing her so much as evaluating her, weighing what shape she might someday hold. The townsfolk rarely spoke his name. At the bakery, Eliza asked casually what people thought of Mr. Silas. The woman behind the counter, flour on her apron, lowered her voice. "He's always been here," she murmured. "Since before I was a girl, maybe longer." "That long?" Eliza asked. The woman shrugged. "No one remembers when he came, or where from. But his work, well, you'll see it." "What do you mean?" The woman leaned closer, her voice nearly a whisper. "The animals. He mounts them for the hunters. Deer, birds, foxes. They say his work is so perfect you can't tell they're dead. Some folks don't like to look too close. Makes them uneasy. Like they'll blink when you're not watching." Eliza tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in her throat. That night, unable to sleep, she crossed to her window. From there she could see the back of Silas's house, where the faint glow of lamplight leaked through narrow panes. The silhouette of a workbench was clear, the outlines of tools neatly hung on the wall, and shapes, animal shapes. She leaned closer, heart quickening. A fox, poised mid-leap, its fur gleaming as though freshly brushed. A hawk, wings extended, feathers catching light as if mid-flight. A stag, tall and regal, antlers crowned in shadow. All so perfect, so alive. She almost expected to hear them breathe. But what froze her was not their posture, nor their silence. It was their eyes. Each one glinted faintly in the lamplight, glassy, flawless, reflecting like mirrors, and each one looked like his. Silas Ispale, luminous eyes. The next day, she forced herself to greet him again. He stood at his gate as if expecting her. "Good morning, Miss Eliza." His voice was smooth, practiced. She tried to keep her tone even. "I saw some of your work last night. Through the window." He tilted his head. "Did you? They're remarkable." His lips curved in that not smile. Perfection is the only acceptable outcome. Her skin prickled. She forced a nod and hurried on, her breath catching until the square was behind her. At night she began to hear it. Not every night, not enough to call it certain, but sometimes, when the wind lulled and the town held its breath, she caught it faintly drifting from the brick house. A steady, rhythmic sound. Pull, tighten, pull, tighten. The scrape of thread drawn through hide. The faint sigh of a needle piercing, sewing, and underneath, perhaps her imagination, the muffled groan of something resisting the stitch. She stopped sleeping well. When she did sleep, she dreamed of glass eyes staring at her from the dark, hundreds of them, their reflections spinning until she no longer knew which belonged to animals and which belonged to men. Sometimes she woke with her hands clutching her own skin, as though afraid she might feel stitches there too. One evening, she lingered near his workshop longer than she meant to. The lamplight was on again. She crept across the square, the wind carrying the faint smell of varnish and resin. She pressed close to the window, peering in through the glass. The fox was still there, the stag, the hawk. But tonight, there was something else. On the workbench lay a human-shaped figure, not alive, not moving, but arranged with terrible care. Its hair was dark, brushed neat, its hands folded across its chest, and its eyes glass, shining, unmistakable. She staggered back, her hand to her mouth. The lamplight flickered. For a split second, the reflection in the window shifted. She saw herself, pale and wide-eyed, but the eyes staring back from her reflection were not her own. Not green, not human, glass. They gleamed with the same pale luster as Silas's. She stumbled away from the window, nearly tripping over the cobblestones, her pulse thundering in her ears. Behind her, in the stillness of the workshop, the sewing sound began again. Pull, tighten, pull, tighten, and in the glass of the window she had fled. Her reflection lingered just a moment longer than it should have, smiling faintly. The square grew quieter the longer she stayed in town. Or perhaps it only felt that way because she was listening harder. Every footstep, every creak of wood seemed magnified in Eliza's ears now, and no matter where she turned, Silas was there, always immaculate, always upright. He walked with the patience of a clock pendulum, never too fast, never too slow. He would nod if she greeted him, but never more. His lips never parted enough for warmth. His eyes never dimmed enough for humanity. And she noticed something else. No one touched him, not even in passing. At the baker's, the woman slid his parcels across the counter but never brushed his hands. The butcher bowed slightly but never met his gaze. Children playing in the street would fall silent when he approached. He was a figure they endured, not embraced. Yet no one spoke against him, not directly. At the tavern one evening, Eliza overheard two men whispering in a corner. "Swear to God, that cat was staring right at me," one muttered. "Glass eyes, but I'd bet my life it was breathing." The other shushed him. "Don't say it out loud. He hears more than you think." They both went silent as the door creaked, and Silas stepped in, his presence filling the dim space without sound. He didn't order a drink. He didn't sit. He simply looked around, nodded once, and left. The air in the tavern only resumed once the door clicked shut. Eliza began to dream more vividly. She dreamed of the stag from his workshop, its glassy eyes reflecting moonlight, its antlers stretching until they pierced the ceiling. She dreamed of birds that beat their wings but never lifted from their perches, their eyes never blinking, always shining. And she dreamed of Silas himself, seated at the edge of her bed, needle in hand, drawing a thread through her skin as casually as a seamstress mending cloth. She would wake with her arm tingling, convinced she'd feel stitches if she dared look. By the third week, her nerves had unraveled. She couldn't shake the image of that human-shaped figure she'd glimpsed on his workbench. She told herself she might have been mistaken. The light, the shadows, they could have played tricks. But another part of her, deeper and darker, whispered that she hadn't been mistaken, that what she'd seen was exactly what it looked like. And so, on a night when the wind carried the faint toll of the church bell and the square was deserted, Eliza crossed into shadow. She carried no lantern. She moved with shallow breaths. Her heart beat so hard it seemed to echo in her ears. The brick house loomed tall before her, its shutters closed, its lamplight faint. She crept to the workshop door at the back. Its lock rusted but frail. She pressed a bobby pin into it, her hands trembling. A click. The door gave. The smell hit her first. Not rot. Not exactly. Something like resin, like polish, like fur kept too long in a sealed box. Sweet and cloying, undercut by something older. She stepped inside. The lamplight glowed dimly, casting every mounted creature into half-life. The fox crouched mid-pounce, its eyes gleaming. The hawk spread its wings wide, feathers sharp as knives. The stag loomed tall, its gaze fixed forward. Eliza froze, her breath shallow. Every one of them looked alive. Every one of them looked as though it had paused just to turn its eyes toward her. And the eyes. Oh, the eyes. All the same. Round, flawless, luminous. Silas's eyes. She moved deeper into the workshop, her shoes whispering against the boards. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with fluids that glinted in lamplight. Needles and thread lay neatly coiled, the spools a dark, dull red that looked too much like blood. And then she saw the others. Not animals. Not entirely. Figures half finished. Their forms collapsed against the walls. A torso stretched with canvas, a head without a face, limbs stuffed with sawdust and straw. They lay like abandoned mannequins, but each one had sockets waiting for eyes. Eliza staggered back, her pulse slamming. She clutched the edge of the workbench, her fingers brushing something cold. She looked down. Achar. Inside floated two glass eyes, pale and shining, catching the lamplight with an unnatural glimmer. They looked up at her with patient calm, as though they had been waiting for her touch. Her stomach lurched. She shoved the jar away, her hand trembling. It rolled across the bench, clinking against another. Inside that jar floated more eyes. A dozen pairs, identical, unblinking. Her breath came ragged. The sound came then, faint at first. Pull, tighten, pull, tighten, Heskin Krolel. It was not her imagination this time. It was coming from the far corner of the workshop. She turned, every nerve screaming. The lamplight flickered, shadows shifted, and though she could not see him, she knew. Silas was there, working, sewing. Her panic surged. She turned to flee, stumbling toward the door, but something made her stop, just before her hand touched the knob. The eyes, every mounted animal, every half-finished form, every glass eye in a jar, all of them were turned toward her now. She could feel it, the weight of their gaze pressing into her skin, holding her in place. Slowly, trembling, she looked back, and she swore their heads had shifted, just slightly, enough that each gleaming eye locked onto hers. Her scream never left her throat. The workshop was silent, save for the steady sound of thread pulling tight in the dark. And somewhere in the reflection of a jar, she thought she saw her own face staring back, with glass eyes. Eliza did not remember how she forced herself out of the workshop that night, only that her lungs were raw with cold air by the time she reached her cottage and that her hands shook so badly she could barely lock the door behind her. She sat against the wall until dawn with her knees pulled to her chest, hearing every groan of wood, every scrape of branch against the window as though it were the echo of needle and thread from that place. When daylight came, it should have reassured her, but the light only made her doubt herself more, as though the horrors she had seen were the residue of a fevered dream. Yet she knew they had been real, because when she looked at her palms, she still felt the ghost of glass under her fingertips. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of dread. Eliza tried to tell herself not to think of Silas, not to glance at his house, not to listen for the faint sounds that drifted across the square at night, but she could not resist. She became hypersensitive to his presence. In the market, she sensed him even before she saw him, his tall frame moving with uncanny precision, his immaculate clothes never wrinkled by wind or weather. On the street, she avoided his gaze, but in her peripheral vision she always caught the gleam of his eyes, pale and reflective, as though he carried the same light in him that shone in the jars on his shelves. The townspeople behaved as if nothing was unusual, as if they had all agreed long ago not to speak the truth aloud. Once or twice she tried to probe them. She asked the grocer whether Mr. Silas had lived here long, whether anyone had ever seen him when he was younger. The grocer smiled politely but changed the subject. She pressed the postman, who only shrugged and muttered that some houses were older than the families who lived in them. No one would meet her eyes. No one would say anything directly. And Eliza began to understand that the silence was not ignorance but fear, the quiet compliance of people who had decided it was easier to live beside something uncanny than to confront it. Her dreams worsened. She dreamed that she was stitched into her bed, her limbs bound with black thread, her skin tightening until it was no longer hers. She dreamed of animals circling her, each one with Silas's eyes, staring down at her with unblinking patience. And she dreamed of herself, standing among them, her own body hollowed, her face polished, her eyes replaced with those same luminous orbs. Each morning she woke drenched in sweat, her throat hoarse, as if she had been screaming all night. One evening she returned from the bakery and found Silas waiting by her gate. He was as precise as ever, his tie perfectly centered, his hands folded lightly in front of him. She froze where she stood, the basket of bread trembling in her grip. He inclined his head with that same rehearsed courtesy and said, "You have not been sleeping well, Miss Eliza." she stammered. How would you know that? And regretted it at once, because the question sounded almost like an admission. His lips curved faintly. Eyes are meant to observe. That is their purpose. She felt the chill crawl across her skin, but forced herself to say, maybe some things are not meant to be seen, and pushed past him into the cottage, her heart hammering until she bolted the door. Through the curtain, she saw him linger, perfectly still for a long moment, before he turned and walked back toward his house with the measured steps of a man who never hurried. By then, she knew she could not bear another night of silence. She packed a small bag with the intention of leaving before dawn, of driving until the town was nothing more than a rumor in her rearview mirror. But that night, as she sat in the half-light, listening for the first toll of the bell that would mark the hour before morning, she heard a sound outside. Not the wind, not the branches. A soft, deliberate scrape along her wall, then another, moving steadily toward her door. She rose slowly, clutching the bread knife she had left on the table, and stepped to the window. In the square, bathed in moonlight, Silas stood. He was not facing her house, not directly, but his head was tilted upward, and even across the distance, she could see the way his eyes reflected the faintest light. They did not glow. They gleamed, as glass does when it catches the flame. The sound came again, scrape, scrape, and she realized with a sick twist that it was not at her door but at her window, the one beside her. She turned, breath locked in her throat. For an instant she saw a pale shape in the glass, a reflection not her own, watching her from the other side. She stumbled back, heart racing, then forced herself to move to the door, to wrench it open, to flee into the square where at least there would be air and distance. But when she stepped outside, Silas was already there. He was closer than she had thought, his immaculate form rising tall, his expression as composed as ever. He regarded her without blinking, and she saw it clearly now. The faint line of a seam at his wrist where the cuff of his shirt had shifted, a dark thread vanishing into flesh that was not entirely flesh. She raised the knife, though her hand shook too violently to make it a real threat. "Stay away from me," she whispered. His head tilted, eyes gleaming like polished glass. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Why run? You are almost ready to be displayed." The words sank into her bones like ice. She stumbled backward, the knife clattering from her grip, and turned to flee. She ran across the square, her shoes striking the cobblestones, the night air burning her lungs. Behind her, she heard no footsteps, no pursuit, but she felt the weight of eyes pressing into her back. Hundreds of them, the animals from his workshop, the jars of glass, the reflection in her own mirror. She did not stop running until the square fell away, until the field stretched out before her, dark and silent. Only then did she collapse to her knees, gasping for air, staring into the endless line of trees. She did not know how long she knelt there, trembling, unable to move. She did not dare look back, because she feared if she did, she would see him standing there still, perfect, patient, waiting. When dawn came, she dragged herself into the woods, away from the town, her throat raw, her voice gone, and though she never looked back, she felt it all the same, the eyes, always watching, always gleaming, as if she had already been measured, already been chosen, already been sewn into some pattern she could not escape. The woods gave her no comfort. She stumbled among roots and thorns until the pale glow of dawn seeped through the branches, her body trembling with exhaustion, her throat so raw she could not summon a scream, even if she tried. By the time she collapsed in a hollow between two trees, her breath came in broken rasps, her skin streaked with scratches, and her eyes so dry they stung. She had not slept, had not eaten, had not thought of anything except the command in her muscles to move, to put distance between herself and the house of Silas. But even in the silence of the forest she felt it, the weight of a gaze that did not belong to animals, or to trees, or to the sky. It pressed on her like a hand on the back of her neck, guiding her forward, reminding her that she had not escaped but merely delayed what waited for her. When they found her, 3 men from the town searching for stray livestock, she could no longer stand. They carried her out on a makeshift stretcher, their faces pale with unease as though they feared touching her too long. She tried to tell them, tried to force words out of her ruined throat, but nothing came, only a hollow rasp that made one of them murmur, "She's lost her voice." They took her to the small infirmary, and the doctor there shook his head gravely. "Shock," he said. "Severe exhaustion. She may recover her strength in time, but her voice, that may never return." He wrapped her in blankets, offered broth she could not swallow, and told her she was lucky to be alive. When she gathered the strength to mouth the name Silas, the doctor's face tightened. He smoothed the blanket as though she were a child and said, "Best not to dwell on neighbors, Miss Eliza. Best to focus on yourself." It was the same tone the grocer had used, the same silence the baker had carried in her eyes. They all knew, but they would never say it aloud. Days passed. She stayed in a small rented room at the edge of town, her body regaining weight, her skin healing from scratches, but her silence remained. People visited out of politeness, bringing bread or flowers, speaking to her as though she were deaf as well as mute, not waiting for her scribbled replies. And when they left, she would stand at the mirror, studying her face, searching for any mark that proved what she had seen had been real. Each night she expected to wake with stitches along her arms, her skin tightened by thread. Each morning she found nothing, yet she could not shake the feeling that something had changed. Something she could not name. It was not until the third week that she saw it. The morning was ordinary, sunlight pale across the room. She leaned over the basin to wash her face and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror above it. Her hair hung limp, her skin still wan, but her eyes no longer looked the way she remembered. They were not the green she had known since childhood. The color her mother had said reminded her of sea glass. They were brighter now, clearer, as though polished from within. When she turned her head, the light caught them strangely, and for a sickening instant they gleamed like glass, reflecting instead of absorbing, shining instead of softening. She stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table, staring into the mirror. The reflection stared back, unblinking, patient, luminous. She whispered soundlessly, her throat straining with the effort. No, but her reflection's lips did not move. Only the eyes glimmered, alive with something that was not her. She smashed the mirror with her fist. The shards fell into the basin, glittering like a scatter of broken eyes, each fragment holding a piece of her face, each shard reflecting back those same uncanny orbs. She pressed her bleeding knuckles to her chest, trembling, unable to look again, but the image was already burned into her mind. She began to notice it elsewhere, in the window when the light was right, in the surface of her tea when it stilled, in the shine of another's spectacles when they turned to greet her. Her eyes did not belong to her anymore. They belonged to something else, something that had measured her and marked her as its own long before she fled the square. She left town within the month, unable to endure the silence of the people or the looming presence of the brick house. She went to another city, another set of streets where no one knew her name. But the eyes followed. She caught strangers staring too long at her, as though something about her unsettled them without their knowing why. Children hid their faces when she passed. Shopkeepers hesitated when she met their gaze. And always, when she was alone, she saw them gleam in the glass of her window, bright as the jars on Silas's shelves. One night, unable to sleep, she pulled the curtains wide and stared into the dark beyond. For a moment she thought she saw the outline of a man in a black vest, standing at the edge of the streetlight, tall and motionless. She blinked, and he was gone, but the gleam remained, faint and steady, like 2 drops of water catching the light, like 2 polished stones waiting to be set into place. Eliza sank to her knees, her throat straining for a scream that would not come. She pressed her palms over her eyes, but even in darkness, the gleam burned through. It was not just a reflection. It was not just a trick of glass. It was a transformation, a claim, a slow stitching of her being into a pattern not her own. She realized then what Silas had meant. When he said she was almost ready, she would never hear his thread against her skin, never feel his needle pull her taut. He had already done enough. He had given her the eyes, and now, wherever she fled, whatever mirror she smashed, she would carry his craft within her. She was already part of his collection, walking among the living, displayed in plain sight. The last thing she saw before she sank into exhausted half-sleep was the faint gleam in the broken shard of the mirror on her floor, winking like a secret between glass and flesh. And though her lips did not move, she could swear she heard a whisper, calm and certain, as though it had been threaded into her silence forever. You are ready now. And so, the hour draws to a close. 7 stories, whispered across the long stretch of night, have settled in your thoughts. Some may fade when dawn arrives. Others may cling like cobwebs, fragile yet impossible to brush away. You've walked with a grieving man who saw too many statues, with a child born from betrayal, with a mirror that remembered more than it should, with a boy of earth and rot, with a dinner guest who was never truly gone, with a tape that confessed when no one else could, and finally, with a craftsman whose eyes were never his own. If you are still awake, then perhaps you've learned what others already suspect, that the night is never empty, only patient. That silence itself tells stories, if you lean close enough. And if you drift into sleep now, know that these tales will follow you, stitched quietly into your dreams, waiting for the next time you press play. This has been your midnight companion, your voice in the dark. Until we meet again, sleep lightly, and keep an eye on what watches you back.